So if we're ready, I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
Ready whenever you are.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. The time is now 8:38, and I would like to call the June 1st, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council to order. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Marcy Grail,
Here.
Kent Howe,
Here.
Cindy Condon,
Here.
Perry Chalktoot,
Here.
Ann Byer.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. I have the following announcements. Please mute your phones, and if you are joining us by phone and receive a phone call, please hang up from this call and dial back in after finishing your other call. For those signed onto the webinar, please do not broadcast your webcam. For agenda item C, public comment period, there are two ways to let us know you are interested in providing comments to the council. For those using the WebEx, you will need to use the raise your hand feature. For those on the phone only, you will need to press *3, which will alert us that you want to speak. We will go over these options again during that agenda item. If you want to receive future email notifications of council meetings, project milestones, or rulemakings through our Click Dimensions program, you can do so by clicking on the link in the agenda or on the council webpage. Look for the green box on the right-hand side of the page that says sign up for emails updates. You are also welcome to access the online project mapping tool and any documents by visiting our website. Please note that the audio and video of this meeting is being recorded and may be posted to the council's website following the meeting. Energy Facility Council meetings shall be conducted in a respectful and courteous manner where everyone is allowed to state their positions at the appropriate times consistent with council rules and procedures. Willful, accusatory, offensive, insulting, threatening, insolent, or slanderous comments which disrupt the council meeting are not acceptable. Pursuant to Oregon Administrative Rule 345-011-0080, any person who engages in unacceptable conduct which disrupts the meeting may be expelled. Our first item this morning is the approval of March 24th, 2023 meeting minutes. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes?
Yes.
All right.
Madam Chair, this is Kent.
Yes, Kent.
I'll move that the council approve the minutes of the March 24th, 2023 meeting as presented and recommended by staff.
Thank you for that motion. Vice Chair Howell, do we have a second?
Second, Cindy Condon.
Thank you, Councilmember Condon. We have a second. Any further comments, questions on this issue?
Actually, this is Cindy. Just a quick comment. In reviewing the minutes, it was great to read Kent's really detailed reason for the GO3 exception, and really a reminder of how important that is. So,
thank you for that comment. All right, well, then if there's nothing else, Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
yes.
Perry Chalktoot,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail.
Yes,
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
thank you. Our next item is presentation, or excuse me, sorry. We have the council secretary report, jumping ahead.
And just checking in, Nancy. So I saw Patrick indicated he can't hear anything. So just making sure that you're checking with him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Got a few things on the list. So a couple project updates, several amendment determination request updates. So the first is related to the Hermiston Power Project. The request was received on March 14th of this year, and the request was whether the installation of a new potable water well at the project site would require an amendment to the site certificate. So the department issued its determination on May 4th, and we agreed with the applicant that this did not trigger an amendment. That was sent to the council on May 5th, and that information is all located on the project page associated with the Hermiston Power Project. Next is the Montague Solar Facility. So additional information related to the change in local economic benefits realized from the development. That one was received in May 27th, 2021. Took a while to kind of work through that issue, evaluate it, and then work with the county on that. And then on May 4th, the department, in consultation with Gillum County, provided a response to the changes and determined that an amendment was not required to the site certificate. That was also sent to council on May 5th and is also located on the project page. Thirdly is the Mist Natural Gas facility. So we received a request on May 2nd, and the request was whether a site certificate amendment is needed for the installation of a section, about a 2,000-foot section of the existing Flora well pipeline. They need to relocate a portion of the pipeline. So that information was sent to council also on May 5th. We have requested some additional information from Northwest Natural and are waiting to get receipt of that to further evaluate to make a determination of whether an amendment is required or not. So we'll give you another update on that at a coming council meeting. Unless there are any questions on the ADRs, I'll move on to some compliance updates. Nancy, can you advance the slide? Okay, first are related to some significant findings associated with construction. First is the Montague Solar Facility. So on April 14th of this year, our consultant who went out there to evaluate the site during the construction identified numerous findings related to the failure to comply with the requirements of the erosion and sediment control plan. This plan is intended to protect agricultural soils by minimizing erosion impacts. This is a requirement of a site certificate condition. The department notified the certificate holder of the condition non-compliance and requested corrections. Subsequently, the Department of Environmental Quality issued violations and civil penalties for failure to comply with the erosion and sediment control plan requirements. So that triggered a non-compliance evaluation by us related to 3 other site certificate conditions. So we've notified the certificate holder of the reporting and resolution requirements under the Division 29, and we're expecting to hear back from them in the next few weeks. Next is the State Line Wind Project. So at the January meeting, I provided an update to you on some non-compliance issues also with erosion control. So subsequent to that update, DEQ issued an enforcement action on the project. The department continues to work with the certificate holder to review the adequacy of the erosion repairs at the site. So we'll wait to see what happens with DEQ to determine if they adequately restore the site in order to close out this non-compliance issue. Next, there are some operational issues that we found. So for the South Mist pipeline extension, during the annual site inspection, it was determined that the calculated excess emissions associated with the compressor station were found to be negative for several years. So this appears to be the result of errors in the reporting. There's definitely fuel usage and it should not be negative. So we're working with Northwest Natural to get additional numbers to determine how much fuel usage was actually occurred at the site to calculate what their CO2 emissions are and if they have enough money in their carbon offsets to pay for that. Next is the Bigelow Canyon Wind Facility. So during a recent inspection, a man door associated with the substation was found unlocked. One of the condition requirements is that all of these doors remain locked for public safety purposes, so people can't access and get electrocuted. So this is the second occurrence of an unlocked door. So we have requested a corrective action plan, and we're waiting to receive that from Portland General Electric. Similarly, at the Wheat Ridge facility, a recent inspection found a turbine tower door was unlocked. So similar to the prior one, there's a condition that requires those to be locked for public health and safety purposes, and we have similarly requested a corrective action plan on that issue. So if council members have any questions on any of the facility updates. Okay, moving on to legislation. So there really are two primary bills that we're tracking that are directly related to FSEC. But before I get into them, you all have been probably tracking the news reports. So there have been walkouts for some time now, limiting the necessary quorum requirements to conduct business for a lot of legislative session. So this has put most bills in an uncertain position, at least ones that haven't already been passed. So I don't really have any updates to share about that other than to just, basically the same thing that you're all hearing is what we're hearing. So the current status is really unclear of the bills, but I'll give you an update of the bills that we're tracking and kind of where they're at now. But really the short is we don't know if they're going to go through. So if there's no quorum and the legislature is suspended without passing any of these bills, then obviously they won't move forward. But like I said, I'll give you an update as to what the bills are and sort of at the last point of, at least we're aware of where they're at in session. So first is House Bill 3179. So that predominantly would change the FSEC jurisdictional thresholds for solar facilities. So currently for high value farmland, that's 160 acres before it is required to go to FSEC. That would increase to 240. Predominantly cultivated lands, that would change from 1,280 acres or 2 square miles to more than 2,560 acres or 4 square miles. So that would double that jurisdictional threshold. And then on any other lands, the current threshold is 1,920 acres or 3 square miles. And that would change that to 3,840 acres or 6 square miles. So those would be county jurisdictional. So that bill passed through the House, made its way to the Senate, and ultimately had a work session. So kind of got through the final committee requirements at the legislature and really was just awaiting to go to the full Senate floor. There may have been some resolution needed on the House side, but that one essentially is waiting for a floor vote at the Senate. For House Bill 3181, this includes numerous elements. The first is it would require the Department of Energy and the Department of Land Conservation and Development to convene stakeholders to identify lower conflict areas for renewable energy and transmission siting and ways to streamline and expedite the siting process and then that would require a report to the legislature. Next, it would require ODO to periodically update the ARESA mapping tool. We've provided updates to you on that before with new layers or updated data layers. Next, counties would be able to go through their own mapping process related to renewable energy siting, and there would be grant funding provided by DLCD for that purpose. And then finally, ODO would be given funds that FSEC could provide to public bodies, tribal governments, and community organizations to participate in the FSEC process. So something like an intervenor funding. Much of that would be, the details of that would be established in a follow-up rulemaking that FSEC would have to do. The language in the bill was pretty thin about how that would actually apply. So a lot of that would have to be established through rulemaking. And that bill is currently at Ways and Means. So again, the big takeaway there is, like everybody else, we're waiting to see what happens with the session and if anything moves forward from here on out.
Todd, this is Marcy. Can you repeat what you said about, I think it was the second thing you said about the counties, or actually the third thing about the counties updating? I think I missed something.
Yeah, so the basic idea of the bill is that, you know, we would convene a bunch of stakeholders and go through and sort of identify areas of lower conflict for renewable energy and transmission siting, and then also look at sort of streamlining opportunities, both at the kind of FSEC level and at the LCDC level that would apply to counties. That would sort of be the, you know, broader approach. But then the idea was to give counties the ability to do Goal 5 inventory mapping, or kind of go through their own process at the local level, and provide funding to them. So if they did that, then they could have, you know, a little more local sort of evaluation about how that would apply, you know, within their jurisdiction. So somewhat, you know, pretty much the same as the first bullet that I talked about, but really it would be more of a local evaluation.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Grail.
Yes.
Cindy Condon. I just have a question with respect to 3179, and I probably should have done some work on this, but given the increases in acreage and metrics for the facilities, of the existing site applications we have or projects that are being developed now, do you have a number or a sense of how many of those would not have been under FSEC jurisdiction if those limits change?
Yeah, it was a pretty high level look, but I did look at all of our current applications and determined that really only one would have met the sort of change threshold. But then there was a question of whether that actually had more high value farm ground than was submitted in the application. So one possibly, you know, really I think the bigger question is, would any of those have altered their acreages to not be within FSEC jurisdiction? So that's where, moving forward, you're looking at the numbers, and would that influence anybody to make changes? Going back to, the wind boom, in the, early mid 2000s, the threshold for FSEC was 105 megawatts. There are many, many 104 megawatt county jurisdictional projects out there.
Of course. And just to follow up on that, so are the counties supportive of this change?
I mean, I think there was only a couple of counties that really sort of participated. So whether they're universally supportive of this or not, I don't know. But I know there was a couple counties who provided comment and were supportive of it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And I'd just like to remind, or I guess not remind, I'd like to tell everyone, because I'm having issues with my phone, I can't see folks. So please just speak up. And if there's anything I'm missing, I'd ask Vice Chair Howe or Todd to flag a person. I apologize. This was not the best device to call in on.
Okay, we'll definitely keep an eye out. Thank you.
Chair Grill, this is Kent.
Yes. Yes.
I have a follow-up question for Secretary Cornett on that. Are there any data yet? Has this been, where the counties are doing more applications for siting energy facilities? Is there a track record yet on the appeals process they're going through?
I mean, I did a little bit of research on that. So there, in 2019, House Bill 2329 increased the thresholds to what they are now, and I kind of described what those are. There are reporting requirements associated with those projects, and we've received notification of 8 projects that went through that kind of House Bill 2329 process. And to my knowledge, 2 of those were appealed. One went all the way up to the Court of Appeals and then kind of back down to the county. So, it kind of did many of what you see at the land use. It went to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and then, sort of, some up and down remanding. That one's back down at the county. that was related to implementation of the natural resource protection requirements. And so that one is still unresolved. And then there was a second one, same owner, project owner, and I think that one has been challenged, and I think that one's sort of on hold as well. So to my knowledge, I think just two of them have been, 2 of the 8 have been challenged.
Okay, thanks.
Great questions. Thank you.
Okay, last on my list are future meetings. So you hopefully saw the emails yesterday. So we've been trying to get the draft proposed order hearings figured out for the Boardman Hemingway Amendment 1. So those got rescheduled again. So we were thinking those would be at the later June meeting of this month. That's not going to happen. So we've changed the June meeting to just June 23rd, or the second June meeting to June 23rd. And that will be a morning meeting, virtually only, just like this. So that should only be a couple of hours. And then July, we sent out the email seeking whether you were all available or not for the 17th, 18th, and 19th. So the idea there would be that the July 17th, we would be in Baker City for an evening public hearing. July 18th, we would be in Pendleton for a evening public hearing. And then July 19th, we would also be in Pendleton for the regular council meeting. Several of you have responded with your availability. For those who haven't, please send an update to Nancy as soon as you can so we can determine whether or not we will have enough for a quorum for that meeting. And with that, that concludes my council secretary report.
Thank you very much, Secretary Fournette. Any further questions? All right, well, hearing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the presentation of the Department of Land Conservation and Development's Farm and Forest Land Use Report. This is an information item. We have Hillary Foote from Department of Land Conservation and Development Farm and Forest Specialist to present. Welcome, Hillary.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much for having me here today, and good morning. So I am Hillary Foote. I'm the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I have to thank Todd for having me here today to review certain sections of the 2020-2021 Biennial Farm and Forest Land Use Report with you. And should I just ask to have the slides advanced?
Yes, Hillary, that'd
Here
be
we
great.
go.
I got it for
Okay, so next slide.
you. Oops.
All right, and the one after that one.
Okay.
Awesome. So today I'm going to be talking about a report that the Land Conservation and Development Commission has been providing to the legislature for over 38 years. It's a statutory obligation that we have, and it's intended to provide some insight into how well our zoning-based working lands conservation program has been performing and achieving the objectives that have been set out for it for statewide planning goals 3 and 4. So bringing to mind that old adage that you can't manage what you can't measure, that's really what this report attempts to do. So today I'm going to be giving an abbreviated version of this presentation. I'm only going to talk about farmlands. We're going to put forest lands aside. I'm going to start with a little bit of the historical context for the Goal 3 program, the Farmland Conservation Program. And I'm going to touch on farmland conversion, some different ways that we look at it in this particular report. There's a lot of different types of ways to look at it, and that it has been looked at by a number of academics and research papers, but I'm going to talk about the Farm and Forest Report. And lastly, we're going to focus on data that was included in the last Farm and Forest Report on solar siting. And that was included, there's about 6-page section included in the last Farm and Forest Report that was a response to a request from the Board of Agriculture to look at how well our rules have been functioning on encouraging solar siting on more appropriate locations. Okay. So next slide, just getting right into it. One of the really important things to understand about exclusive farm use zoning is that it is and always has been associated with a tax program. And it predates the land use planning program by over a decade. Exclusive farm use zoning was originally standardized statewide in 1963 as part of an incentive tax program that kind of went like this. If you were a farmer, you could volunteer to have your property enrolled in the program. The county would apply a restrictive exclusive farm use zone to your property, and in exchange for that restriction, your property would be assessed at its farm value rather than its market value or its highest and best use value. And this was a policy tool that was actually adopted by a number of states across the US during the 1950s and 1960s as a policy response to a rapid loss of prime agricultural lands following World War II. And so what you saw were mechanized factory processes that were developed to support the war effort being applied to housing production and personal automobiles that really set the stage for the rise of the suburbs. And because cities tend to be located where there is good farmland, the suburbs, that sprawl extended into high value farm areas. All right, so Oregon was none of a number of states that created that incentive tax program to preserve agricultural lands. And while it was a popular program, it didn't really achieve the objective that was set out for it. So during the 1960s and 70s, we continued to see a large loss of farmland, particularly in the Willamette Valley. So between 1955 and 1970, over 500,000 acres in the Willamette Valley of high-value prime farmlands were urbanized, converted to sprawl. And during the 1960s alone, about a third of the farmlands in Clackamas County were developed or lost. All right, so that set the stage for a few eloquent farmland preservation advocates to support what farmland protection and the statewide land use planning program that was created when Senate Bill 100 was enacted. That's the landmark land use bill that we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of just last week on the Capitol. So that's very exciting. So what Senate Bill 100 did, it told counties, it required counties to look throughout their jurisdictions for agricultural lands that met our definition, DLCD's definition of agricultural lands, to inventory them, and then it required them to apply that restrictive exclusive farm use zoning to agricultural lands. Then the incentive tax program that was associated with exclusive farm use zoning became a compensatory program rather than an incentive program. And that tax program is part of a suite of benefits that are conferred on agricultural landowners in exchange for restrictive exclusive farm use zoning. All right. I usually don't bring up Senate Bill 101, which is a partner bill, the agricultural lands bill, to Senate Bill 100, but I'm going to do a little diversion here because I want to talk about the agricultural lands policy. So one of the things that Senate Bill 101, the partner bill to Senate Bill 100 did was it overhauled the exclusive farm use zoning. And as part of that overhaul, it codified a legislative policy statement on agricultural lands. And this policy statement, which is in section 215, 243 of statute, predated by goal 3 by a couple of years. Goal 3 references it. And so when you're considering an exception to statewide planning goal 3, it is the principles of this policy statement and the standards and the rules that implement it that are being waived because there's something about a property or a project that merits waiving those standards that implement the principles of this policy statement. All right, so the agricultural land policy essentially says that it recognizes that agricultural economy is dependent on a finite land resource. Grazing lands and croplands are dependent on certain types of resource soils, right? It's locationally dependent resource, right? The policy recognizes that the agricultural sector is important to the state, not just the state's economy. It certainly is. It's depending on how you slice it, about 7% of the GDP for the state. But agricultural lands are also important to the health and well-being of citizens in general, not just food security and food sovereignty, but for those less tangible values like aesthetics and open space and environmental co-benefits, so habitat, air quality, water quality as well. And the policy explicitly recognizes that the preservation of agricultural land base is so important that the mandatory restrictive zoning program is merited and that that suite of compensatory benefits are also merited along with those restrictions. All right, so I just wanted to mention that for the council, so a little impromptu digression. All right, next slide. Really quickly, a couple notes on the structure of the program. So uses that are allowed in exclusive farm use zones are established by the state legislature. They're standardized across the state, and generally those uses are divided into 2 buckets. So the first bucket of uses, type 1 uses, are uses that the legislature finds to be compatible with the rural landscape and with farm uses that might be occurring in the surrounding area. The second bucket of uses are type 2 uses, as we call them, and are typically processed as conditional uses, including power generating facilities, are uses that the legislature finds may or may not be compatible with a rural environment and agricultural and forest activities that are occurring in the area. And so counties are required to evaluate those specific proposals and find that they aren't going to have a significant impact on farm operations in the surrounding area or the cost of farming in the surrounding area. That's known as the Farm Impacts Test. Sometimes it's referred to as 215, 296. All right, next slide. All right, so we've established that farmland is important to the state, and we've went to a lot of effort to create this mandatory program for its conservation. And we have provided benefits to landowners in exchange for sort of the mandatory conservation of farmland. How well has the program been performing at, keeping working lands in agricultural and forest uses? All right. So while a lot of research has been done on this topic, the Farm and Forest Report kind of looks at 4 different ways. 1, how much land has been maintained in exclusive farm use zoning, that protective zoning. 2, how much land is actually in farm use as determined by the U.S. Census of Agriculture. 3, we look at sort of land resource cover through aerial photogrammetry review. And then lastly, we look at the number of non-farm use approvals that counties have issued. So starting off with the first one, land maintained in exclusive farm use zoning. This is actually an agency key performance metric for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We report on it every year. Since 1987, when all of the counties comprehensive plans were acknowledged by LCDC. Since 1987, over the past 34 years, 99.7% of land that was zoned for exclusive farm use is still zoned for exclusive farm use. Roughly 42,000 acres have been removed from protective farm use zoning, either as a result of a zone change or a UGB expansion, urban growth boundary expansion. So that's roughly 1,500 acres a year that's removed from protective exclusive farm use zoning. And note that this is a conservation program, not a preservation program. So it's anticipated that there's going to be some amount of conversion of farmland occurring over time. Keep that number in mind because we're going to come back to it a little bit later. All right, so by that metric, the program is performing really well. Another way to look at it is through this NASS data, National Agricultural Statistics Survey. So according to the Census of Ag, more land was in farm use in 1987. I love it when data aligns. Than was protected under exclusive farm use zoning. So in 1987, 17.8 million acres were reported in farm use in the state. About 16.1 million acres were protected under exclusive farm use zoning. By 2017, fewer acres were reported in farm use than were protected under exclusive farm use zoning. So 15.9 million acres were reported in farm use, 16 million acres were in exclusive farm use zoning. So something is going on where land that is protected under the farm program, farm use is not actually continuing to occur on those lands. Next slide. Another great data source that we rely on heavily is a report that's prepared by the Department of Forestry. They've been capturing aerial photogrammetry since the 1970s and classifying it into different resource land covers based on review of that aerial photogrammetry. So the takeaway here is that if you look at this data, which doesn't necessarily line up with zoning very well, they would find that 98% of land that appeared to be in resource land cover in 1984 is still in some type of resource land cover. So there's a 1% difference there, but it equates to about 320,000 more acres of land that has been removed from a resource land use and converted to low density residential. That's the 250,000 acres roughly, or urbanized, and that's 130,000 acres roughly over that 37-year period. All right, next slide. So what that all tells us is that there's some conversion to non-farm use even while these properties are maintained under the protective zoning program. Which brings us to sort of our last way to look at conversion or conservation of agricultural lands, and that's in the sort of non-farm uses that are approved by counties on land that's protected for farm use. So when the program was initiated in the 1960s, there were 5 non-farm uses that were permissible on lands that were protected under the zoning. And since 1973, the legislature has added new uses to the farm zone almost every session. So now there are over 60 uses that are permitted on exclusive farm use zone land. And I think one of the things that the Farm and Forest report attempts to do is provide insight into how many and what types of non-farm uses are being approved, where they're located. So, when we're talking about solar siting and conversion of agricultural lands to renewable energy development, it's only a small part of the picture. There are a number of other uses that are permitted on agricultural lands that represent a de facto conversion from agricultural use to other things. So it's not just solar siting, it's one part of the picture of what's happening in conversion to non-farm uses. So this chart here shows the top 10 non-farm uses permitted by counties since 2008. Commercial power generating facilities are the yellow line that you see there. And interestingly, they represent the third most commonly permitted use by counties out there after home occupations and commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, which are both sort of catch-all use categories that can look like a number of different things. And when we, next slide, please, look at what that means, what's included in this category. And I would just also note when we're talking about here are permits that are approved by local governments pursuant to our rules. This data does not look at or capture exceptions that have been permitted. So if we look at this pie chart at the top of the slide here, the yellow, and this is the number of power generating facilities approved by local governments pursuant to DLCD rules on farmland since 2008. The yellow are solar projects. The sort of tannish color are wind projects. So really, the bulk of that has been solar projects that have been approved over the past 12 years. And these are approvals, again, issued by local governments pursuant to our rules. And that's only one of 3 ways that solar projects get approved in the state of Oregon. So as many of the council members know, there are 2 other ways that solar projects get approved. So the solar projects also get approved by counties, waiving the standards in our rules, which requires an exception to statewide planning goal 3 through DLCD's goal 3 exception process. And projects are also, of course, approved by the council through your exception process, which is different, a different set of criteria than DLCD's exception process and somewhat less stringent standards. Okay. So if you look at the pie chart on the bottom right, the number of permit approvals issued by counties pursuant to our rules is that light yellow cream color. The light blue are county exceptions and the dark blue are FSEC exceptions. So if you're talking about the number of permits issued for solar projects, by far the bulk of permits issued are done by counties pursuant to our rules. But because we're talking about a farmland conservation program, and what we're really concerned about here are the number of acres of farmland that are being converted, we also look at the footprint that's being approved of those solar projects. So the number of acres of farmland that's being converted to solar use. And that pie chart on the lower left looks at solar acres that have been permitted by review authority. So again, the light yellow are the number of acres permitted by local jurisdictions pursuant to our rules. The light blue, local jurisdictions taking exception through our exception process. And the dark blue, the number of acres of solar permitted by FSEC, subject to your exception process. So by far, the bulk of capacity, the bulk of footprint for solar projects, the bulk of farmland converted to solar development is being approved by the council. So if you look at the acreage impact through all 3 of those processes, since 2011, over 25,000 acres of farmland have been approved for conversion to solar development. That's about 40 square miles. So I want to recall that number that we talked about earlier, that since 1987, 42,000 acres of land has been removed from exclusive farm use zoning as a result of zone changes or urban growth boundary expansions. And I'm mentioning that just to provide a little context for what's happened over the past 10 years with solar siting approvals. Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right, so you may have noticed that I switched from 2008 to 2011. And that's because in 2011, LCDC adopted rules for siting solar projects that require every project to identify the type of farmland that the property it's being located on is, or to determine the farmland classification for the property on which it is being located. Yeah. And that is one of three things. So it's either located in high value farmland pursuant to, or as defined in 195-300, which is a newer definition and causes a little bit of confusion sometimes. It is located on arable land or non-arable or cultivatable land, or it is going to be located on non-arable lands. In 2018, the Board of Agriculture adopted a policy resolution concerning the development of energy, both transmission and generation facilities on agricultural lands, and they expressed some concern about the conversion of high value and more productive farmlands to energy facility development in that policy resolution. And they specifically requested that LCDC, Land Conservation Development Commission, evaluate the effectiveness of our rules at encouraging energy facility development at more appropriate locations on less productive agricultural lands, and upholding the intent of Goal 3 and that policy statement we talked about earlier. And that 6-page section of the Farm and Forest report that includes a lot of this data and discussion is response to that request from the Board of Agriculture. So DLTCD's solar siting rules are designed to encourage solar siting on non-arable lands by allowing larger projects to be sited on non-arable lands without taking a goal exception. And when you look at the data, the bulk of the capacity or the bulk of the acreage footprint associated with solar development that is approved at the local level, approved pursuant to our rules, is indeed sited on non-arable lands. The vast majority of it is. However, as we just saw, although more permits are issued by counties pursuant to our rules, far more capacity, far more acreage impacts are approved through the exception process, which waives our rule standards. Yeah. So the response to the Board of Ag here would really be, yes, our rules are working when they are applied, but the majority of solar capacity that's been approved in the state has been permitted, waiving those rule standards. Overall, when you look at the acreage impact of projects approved under all three pathways, and this is what this pie chart up here in the top right looks at, a slightly more acreage has been approved on non-arable lands, that's the gray, than on arable lands, which is in green, or on high value farmland, which is in yellow. If you just look at acreage approved by the council has approved more projects on arable lands than on non-arable lands or on high value farmlands. So lastly, I want to take a quick look at how solar acres are distributed across the state. So this map up here in the top left corner attempts to visualize that. The counties in white have less than 500 acres of solar projects permitted in them. The darker counties, the dark green counties here, Wasco and Lake, have more than 6,000 acres of solar projects approved in those counties. And it's not really surprising to find that more capacity, more acreage has been permitted for solar development throughout Central Oregon than say like on the coast. But the reason that we feel like this is important to track and to bring up is that there are certain counties, and I would just add that this is data through the end of 2021. So this doesn't include anything that was permitted or approved in 22 or 23. And I know there's a couple of counties who would be much darker in here, like Morrow. So this is important, again, because there are certain counties out there that are seeing more acres being approved for solar development, which means more farmland with the potential to be converted to solar development. And in those counties where thousands of acres are being approved, there's an increasing risk that cumulatively the impact of thousands of acres of converted farmland can have a significant impact on the agricultural economy of those areas. And so we're thinking of, particularly support businesses like processing facilities, logistics and distribution facilities, those sorts of things. All right. And the bottom graph here was really an attempt at showing the farmland classification impact across counties. It's hard to visualize because Lake and Wasco, Gillum and Morrow have so much more impact than other counties, but you'll see here that Lake is mostly non-arable. Wasco is mostly arable. Morrow has been mostly arable and high value. So you can kind of get a sense of how that farmland classification impact plays out across the state. All right, next slide. So I've been talking for a while, looking forward to the future. DLCD will continue to track the potential impact of solar approvals across farmland. I want to give a bit of a shout out to the Department of Energy staff who are extremely helpful. And thank you guys for your assistance in compiling data needed to create this section of the report. We're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with staff at the Department of Energy and Department of Agriculture on these conversations regarding the siting of solar on farmland going forward into the future. So I'm happy to answer any questions the council might have if we have time, Todd, or I'm also happy to come back and provide additional information on this topic that I like talking about.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think we have plenty of time. So if council members have questions, this is a great opportunity. This is a great presentation. Thank you very much. Hillary is exactly what I was hoping for. And if council members have questions, I think we certainly have enough time.
Chair Grail.
Yes.
This is Kent. And Todd, I want to thank you for requesting Ms. Foote to come over from DLCD and do this presentation. I had a career in this for like 38 years in county planning, and this is one of the best presentations I've heard on
Wow.
the conversion of ag land. And anyway, very, very well done, Ms. Foote. I do have a question. We've been seeing applicants come in that we're trying to raise the bar on making sure that they provide us with all the information we need in order to justify these exceptions. And I think we're doing pretty good at that. One of the questions that I have is, I've heard of the term, and I'm sure you have too, agrivoltaics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a solar facility can be put in, but yet underneath it, there could still be some agricultural use of the land. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so it's something that's come up quite frequently in conversations. So as part of our 2011 rulemaking, we did have provisions it might have been the 2017 rulemaking. I don't want to misspeak there. But there are provisions in our rules that would allow a developer to expand their project footprint if they had approved agricultural plan with the county. No developers took advantage of that opportunity to submit an agrivoltaic plan in exchange for sort of expanded footprint. So that provision in our rules has since sunsetted, and there hasn't been a ton of conversation about that. So it did seem like that incentive wasn't necessarily working.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good
Other
presentation.
questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
I was just saying, good presentation, Ms. Foote.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chair Howe. I appreciate it.
Other
Grail?
questions? Yes.
This is Ann Byer, echoing Kent's thank you to Ms. Foote for the presentation, very helpful. Couple of things that are interesting to note. We aren't seeing solar development at any scale in the Willamette Valley, which again suggests that the farmland protection programs of the LCD are working well. But just a reminder kind of to us that the Department of Energy has different policy goals perhaps than DLCD, even though we work for the same state government. And our standards in applying our siting criteria are different than what the counties do. I think it's interesting that we're still seeing most of the solar on non-arable lands, and that's encouraging. We don't have that particular test in the FSEC decision process, but certainly we've weighed those issues as we've considered some of these bigger projects, and we'll always, I think, have different standards than perhaps DLCD and county governments have, but it's interesting to see how those play out on the landscape, and this is a really good summary, so thank you.
Yeah, Chair Grella, if I might jump in real
Yes,
quickly. Just in response, Councilmember Byer. So I didn't have time to make an update on my secretary report because I just sort of concluded the evaluation yesterday. But we did receive earlier this month notice of intent for a 199 megawatt solar facility in Lynn County. So just south of Brownsville. It would be about 2.5 square miles right next to I-5. And so we are going to get the notice out on that notice of intent very soon. So obviously that's going to be high value farm ground. It's in the Willamette Valley. So this is the first that we're seeing of that scale. And I'll have a bigger update on that at the June 23rd meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really informative and interesting that we're starting to see those kind of proposals, and that will really test the council on our decision making. So thank you.
Other questions, comments? Well, I want to say,
Chair Grail?
yes,
Councilmember Condon is raising her hand. She'd like to ask something.
thank you for the help, Vice Chair Howe. Go ahead, Councilmember Condon.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Thanks, Vice Chair Howe, for recognizing me. Thank you so much for the presentation. I am not a planner, have no planning background, and found it very, very informative as a foundation. So thank you for that. A question, and related to an earlier topic we discussed with respect to House Bill 3179, and I'm just curious how that bill, how you consider that bill knowing this information and being in it daily.
That's an interesting question, Councilmember Condon. So it's a little bit, we're sort of waiting for things to settle out and finalize. And of course, we will work with the framework that the legislature provides for us going forward. And I think the important thing here is that we keep having these conversations among our agency staff that are working on these issues and collaborating to make sure that these programs are sort of being carried out in an intent with the law and with policies that have been established. There's a great
Okay.
non-answer for you.
Thank you for that. I'll just take that and I'll wait and see. I'll see what happens. And if I have a follow-up on a different, if I may, if no
Yes.
one else.
Mhm.
And it's related to drought. We've heard by some of the applicants water as an issue. And I'm wondering how that plays in a long-term view for the work you do.
So I think this is a very interesting topic, Council Member Condon. So thank you for bringing it up. So water, impacts the program in a number of different ways. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what the integrated water resource strategy that's currently being developed for 2023 by OWRD might include relative to land use this time around. As far as energy facilities goes, water is implicated in how you define high value farmland under 195-300, right? And, actually under the original definition, it impacts the land use capability classification of land that we're talking about. So it can influence whether it's high value or arable, et cetera. As far as how it impacts the program otherwise, it's come up in conversations with counties around how sufficiency of water should be evaluated when you're looking at a farm impacts test. Is this use going to be taking water away from allocations for irrigation or otherwise? But there are no good answers to those questions right now. So it's something that we are engaging in conversations on, again, through the integrated water resource strategy process that OWRD is managing right now. I think we're having that conversation about how there could be more coordination between the land use planning program and the water resource department's program as well.
Thank you for that as well. And if I may, I have just one more question. And it's related to urban or suburban sprawl onto agricultural and forest land versus an energy facility that may have a shorter lifespan than construction buildings and harder builds on the landscape. And I'm wondering how that fits in to how the department looks at, or the commission looks at, solar versus development of industrial for industrial use, other industrial use, or housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of, so thank you, Councilmember Condon. So there is a lot of conversation that's happening right now about urban growth boundary expansion, about housing, and when agricultural lands are officially urbanized, that's happening through a zone change or through an urban growth boundary expansion. And when lands are added to a UGB, they are no longer set aside for rural resource uses. They are now intended to be urbanized going forward into the future. And when a property is removed from farm zoning or forest zoning, there's an exception process that goes along with it where, there needs to be some demonstration that there are reasons, usually now this day and age, there are other pathways for an exception, but typically you're going to find more reasons exceptions. That property shouldn't be protected under the program, that there's something unique about that property or a development that's really needed to precipitate that removal from production. So it's a very different process than what we're talking about with solar, or maybe, some other uses that merit an exception where a certain level of solar development is permissible, even while that property is still maintained under, protective exclusive farm use zoning, ostensibly because a county has found that it's not going to impact, agricultural operations in the surrounding area, the cost of agricultural operations in the surrounding area. Likewise, any other type of industrial development that might be permitted, say as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, that's allowed under the program. Again, you'll find also solar projects and other types of resources that require taking an exception to statewide planning goal 3, just like you would if you were changing the zoning designation. And so again, it requires that there's something unique about that property, or about the circumstances, or about the proposal that merits waiving, the standards that implement those principles and policies of the Agricultural Lands Protection Program. I don't know if that answered your question, Councilwoman, but there's some differences, and in some ways not. There may not be differences in when you take an exception. It's a similar kind of process, but as far as the longevity of the use, I'm not aware of any solar or wind projects that have been decommissioned where the land has been restored to an agricultural use. So it'll be interesting to see how that might unfold going forward into the future.
Thank you. Yeah, just my thinking is that a solar project, maybe a wind project, might have a lighter touch on the landscape and be able to be used in the future for farming or forest land. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So this is Marcy, and I have a question for you, or maybe an observation. No great secret that our state has endured tremendous wildfires over the last few years, and I'm no meteorology expert and certainly not familiar with land use except for my experience here. How do you see wildfires impacting the lands as you do your work, and subsequently any potential effect on FSEC?
Thank you, Chair Grail. That's a very interesting question. It comes up more in the context of Goal 4 in forest lands, which has standards built into it that address sort of the protection of it's really protections that are really designed to protect timber stands from introduction of risk that would increase the potential for wildfires. As far as the agricultural lands program, I think the conversations have really, been around restoration of agricultural lands post-fire, introduction of hazards, and it's easier to restore agricultural lands than it is forest lands post-fire. So those are conversations that are sort of ongoing. I don't know, is there a different way of framing that question, Chair Grail?
It's, and I recognize it's a large topic. The reason I asked specifically is because as we've done numerous public hearings, for example, around transmission infrastructure, fires are a huge deal. And so when we talk about, what happens to lands and things, it's just an observation, I think, and I'll certainly read more about Goal 4. We obviously keep talking about Goal 3 in our space, so thank you for that. I'll do some more research. So does anyone else have any additional questions for Ms. Foote?
Chair Grail, for the record, this is Perry Chalktooth.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead, Chair Member Chalktooth.
In my experience, Klamath and Lake County does all they can to go through their process to circumvent any type of guidelines for solar due to the problem with irrigation. It all comes down to money. If they can't irrigate that land because there's really no water down here, we're in the middle of a massive drought. This last year was, a pretty good water year, but we're going to have numerous years like this to fill the aquifer and allow irrigation as it was. So what the idea is, if we can't irrigate this farmland and make money raising alfalfa or potatoes or hay or grain, let's convert it into solar. And if you look through Lake County and you look through Klamath County, you can see all kinds of solar projects coming up right in the middle of high value farmland, because it's their constituents, they're the voting bulk of Southern Oregon. And so everybody wants to get voted back into office. So they're going to do what they can to make sure these solar projects go through. And we've got them right here in the basin, and all of it out here is high value farmland. So they say. There was a study done in the late 1800s that said the land out here wasn't fit for farming because of the high volcanic makeup of the soil. The water drops right through the soil. It doesn't have a high level of clay in it, which would hold the water, fairly in the surface. So, that combined with the cents on a dollar agreement with Pacific Corp to run their pumps and pump water out on their field, when that ended in 2006, everybody was trying to figure out a different way to make money on the land. And what's their answer? Solar. And it's popping up all over down here. I haven't seen a lot of these projects come before us at FSIC, so they have to be permitted by the counties. So, that's just my opinion on it. If we get a chance to come down and look ever, I'll point them out. And some of them pretty expansive too. So thank you for the time to talk today. I appreciate you. It was a good report.
Thank you, Councilmember Choctaw. So Ms. Foote, I think overall, I think we have all told you that we value what you've shared with us. And I hope that there's an opportunity for you to join us again. I think it's been clear for at least me during my time on the council that your department works well with FSEC staff for us to be able to make the decisions necessary. So thank you again for your time today.
And thank you very much, Chair Howe, our Vice Chair Howe, Chair Grail, and Todd for inviting me here today. It's been a pleasure, and I'm happy to come back and talk anytime. All right, thank you.
All right. Well, the next item on our agenda is the public comment period. This is an information item. This time is reserved for the public to address the council regarding any item within council jurisdiction that is not otherwise closed for comment. Items closed for comment include the Nolan Hills Wind Power Project. I will defer to Nancy to run this item to see if we have anyone wishing to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do see Angela Crowley has her hand up. Angela, I have unmuted your mic.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, council members. My name is Angela Crowley Cook. I'm the executive director of OSEA, the Oregon Solar Plus Storage Industries Association. I mostly wanted to give some of our comments on the report that you just heard, but before I do that, I did want to note that back in the legislative report that you heard, there was a question about HB 3179 and whether counties supported that bill or not. And I wanted to let you know that the Association of Oregon Counties has come out strongly in support of that bill. So most counties do indeed support that piece of legislation. So I wanted to talk about the report you just heard and give some other information that maybe wasn't part of the report. One thing I took away, though, from that great report was that 98% of our agricultural land in Oregon remains protected. So when I hear that, I think, well, that's excellent. Our laws have been working. We're not in a crisis when it comes to losing farmland in Oregon, but we are in a climate crisis. And that's why we're seeing these new Oregon laws and these new solar projects and permits for solar projects coming in Oregon and all around the country. Chair Grail noted the increase in wildfires. Of course, the climate crisis is exacerbating those wildfires, droughts. Council member Choctoot noted that farmers can no longer farm due to droughts in areas of Klamath and Lake counties. All of these negative impacts on the land are increasing because of the climate crisis, which is why we believe that in many cases solar is an exception and deserves an exception to some of these goals, because our land use laws created in that Senate Bill 100 did not take our current climate crisis into consideration. One other note, well, first I want to talk a little bit about the different types of soil and land that some of these projects are on. In Klamath and Lake counties, those are some of the counties you saw with the most permitted solar. Remember that those soils are not technically high value farmland. They're very little class 1 and 2 soils. However, there are class 3 and 4 soils, which is what those counties would consider high value farmland in those counties. And I would argue that during these times of droughts, when you can't farm on some of those lands anymore, solar is actually a great way to keep that land available for farming. Solar can be removed from the land very easily. I know many members on the council have seen these utility scale projects, solar projects personally, and know that you literally just pull the steel out of the ground. They're very different from some of the other land uses that you've seen that require sewer and lots of buildings, multiple roads that are really more permanent conversions of land. Solar is a temporary conversion of land. If water comes back, like we all hope it does in Klamath County, and it's more profitable for that land to go back to farming, those farmers can end their leases, and you know, when the solar lease is up, and they can return that land back to agriculture very easily. So please do keep that in mind when we're talking about our current climate crisis and the balance that we really need to have to protect those lands by addressing the climate crisis. So like I said, we should be making some exceptions to our land use goals really because of the climate crisis. The report mentioned that the exception used for many of these projects is because they're close to transmission. And we believe that should be a notable exception and a worthwhile exception, because our land use goals did not anticipate that being a need for projects like this and really for renewable projects. So it is exceptional that these projects do have very particular land use needs, needing to be sited close to transmission, which is different really than other types of development. And I wanted to address again, the difference in soils and where is the best place for solar projects to be developed. We're getting to a place now where it is very challenging to find those perfect spots when it comes to soil, wildlife, and other concerns. If solar is prevented from being built on arable lands, then the solar gets pushed onto more marginal lands. And remember that that's where our wildlife is. And so, you know, if solar is pushed from one use to another, pretty soon we're ending up in this situation where everybody says, sure, we want solar, but not here. And all of a sudden you don't have places left. And so we really need to think about all our uses of land in the future of the climate crisis and how it's affecting all of those uses and how we can hopefully prevent some of the worst of those impacts. One of the most promising pieces of solar is agrivoltaics, which was mentioned, and there was a question about it. It's very promising. Oregon State is actually one of the leaders in the country on agrivoltaic research. They have research right now happening outside of their campus in Corvallis. And I wanted to note that the LOI that was mentioned for that large solar project in Lynn County is looking at agrivoltaics. That area right now is being used for grass seed farming, and the developers are looking into continuing grass seed farming and also having sheep grazing under those panels. So there are ways to keep the land in active agriculture while having solar there. I'll also note that Hillary mentioned that, well, she categorized it as developers did not take advantage of the DLCD option for agrivoltaics, but actually the rules that DLCD passed required counties to pass ordinances about agrivoltaics first. And counties only had 2 years to do that, and no county was able to pass those ordinances in the 2 years. Developers would have loved to have worked with counties to have more robust agrivoltaic ordinances, but 2 years just wasn't enough time to complete that. We still hope to see more agrivoltaics in Oregon, and I think the new project that Todd mentioned with the LOI will be a great example of that. Next, I'd like to say we do have already a very vigorous process, both at the county and of course here at the council. You all work very hard to make sure that all of the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted to make sure that these projects all fit the requirements and meet all the rules and guidelines set out. It's a little deceptive, I think, to look at total acreage. It's helpful to remember that every single project and all of those acres has gone through a very diligent process of which you all are a big part of. And a reminder too, that just because projects are permitted doesn't mean that those projects will be developed. Developing solar projects and other renewable projects is very complicated and financially risky. And getting a permit is only one stage in the process. Right now, because of the lack of transmission, finding that space to interconnect to the grid and to be able to send your power through the grid is a major roadblock. And so it's a little deceptive to look at permitted acres, and it's not necessarily telling you what the future of those projects will be. So in conclusion, just I'll do my own looking forward. We want to make sure that looking forward, we're doing all we can to address the climate crisis and protect all of the uses of land that we have here in Oregon. And a reminder that while, of course, my organization would like to see as much solar built in Oregon as possible for our economic development benefits and property tax benefits and job benefits, that's just not going to happen. Solar is being developed mainly in other states because it is so challenging to develop solar in Oregon. And so when we think about our state climate goals, it's good to remember that not all of that renewable energy will be built in Oregon. There's a lot of interest right now in wind in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho. And so, you know, we're really a national and regional grid. And so not everything will be built here in Oregon as much as we'd like to see those economic development impacts. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Angela. Are there any questions for Angela?
Chair Grail, this is Kent. And,
Yes,
yes, Ms. Crowley Koch, what was the organization that you're speaking for?
Oregon Solar Plus Storage Industries Association. You can see our logo behind me, OSEA.
Oregon Solar, one more time?
And Storage.
Got it.
Industries Association, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Other questions?
Just to reiterate on how to raise your hand in WebEx in case you were wanting to participate. At the bottom of the right main window is a set of icons. Click on the participants. In the bottom right participant window is a hand icon. If you click on that, that will raise your hand. Clicking it again will lower your hand. If you're using the call-in feature, press *3 on your telephone keypad to raise your hand, and you would press *3 again to lower your hand.
Thank
Daryl,
you.
for the record, this is Perry Chalktooth.
Yes.
I really don't have a question for Miss, what was your name? I forgot. Let's see.
It's Crowley Cook.
Crowley Koch. But I do got a statement. I'm a lifetime resident of Oregon, and I come from several generations of lifetime Oregonians. And what my main concern is, sure, we want clean energy in Oregon, but we want to utilize the energy that's created in Oregon and in Oregon. If you look at the grid, the Bonneville power grid, it goes straight to California. Even our own cogen plant, if you look at their grid, it comes out and does a horseshoe and goes right to California. So my concern is that we need to use our energy here in Oregon, not to send to California. We use some, but not what we should. We should use a lot more. Energy, so much energy is produced in Oregon. The ratepayers should be paying minuscule bills rather than high bills. And as of 07, we paid a surcharge for dam removal on every power bill. You know, so we're constantly feeling the brunt of the cost of power, but we don't get the benefits that it should provide given the energy that is produced in Oregon. So I just wanted to say that, and I really thank you for your presentation, and I'm sure we'll have another one sometime in the future. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and that's a really great point. And it sort of points to the fact that California passed all these clean energy laws before Oregon did. And so that's part of the reason you see some of our energy produced in Oregon heading to California. But now, of course, we have our own laws, a stronger renewable portfolio standard, 100% clean electricity standard by 2040. And so I think this is going to change, and we're going to see more of Oregon's energy produced in Oregon, staying in Oregon.
Thank you. Nancy, has anyone else raised their hand?
I do not have anyone with their hand raised, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Last call for public comments. Hearing none or seeing none via Nancy, I'm going to close the public comment period at 10:04. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And again, Angela, thank you for joining us with your observations. It is now time for a short break if council members are up for that. So my question to everyone is, would you like 10 or 15 minutes?
Ten ought to do. This is Kent.
Thank you, Vice Chair House, and T spoke first. We are going with that. It's 10:05. If you would please be ready to resume at 10:15, I would appreciate it. Thank you. All right, the time is 10:16 and we are ready to resume with our next agenda item, which is an overview of council's organizational expertise and financial assurance standard. This is an information item, and we have Patrick Rowe, the Oregon Department of Justice Senior Assistant Attorney General and Counsel to FSEC, to present. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Grail. At the outset, I'll note that I've been having some connection problems this morning. So if I drop off suddenly, I'll try to get back as quickly as I can. I'm going to be walking through, as you mentioned, the two of council standards, organizational expertise and retirement and financial assurance. I'll provide an overview of the standards. I'll talk about documents that applicants typically provide to demonstrate compliance with those standards. We'll talk about conditions that council must include in the site certificate regarding these standards. Talk about conditions that council has often included. And at the end, we'll talk about get your input and see if you're comfortable with the existing rules and conditions, or if there's anything that you think we could do to improve them. Next slide, please, Nancy. So first we're going to talk about organizational expertise. This is the standard. A simple way to look at this standard is it asks, is the applicant qualified? Do they have the expertise to construct, operate, and retire the facility that they're proposing? So you'll note on this slide, I've highlighted that it says council must find that the applicant has that expertise, but it also says that council may consider the applicant's access to technical expertise. Why does that matter? Next slide, please, Nancy. It matters because applicants often rely on their parent companies to demonstrate compliance with the organizational expertise standard. As you know, applicants are often project-specific limited liability companies, and they turn to their parents to show that they have the expertise to construct, operate, and retire the facility. Next slide, please. This is a mandatory condition. And if an applicant or certificate holder is relying on a parent to demonstrate organizational expertise, this condition requires that they inform the department before the parent transfers ownership of the certificate holder. This gives the department an opportunity to assess if the new parent has the sufficient expertise to operate and retire the facility. Next slide, please. Now I'll walk through some conditions that aren't mandatory, but that council typically includes. These are from a couple recent site certificates. Both require the certificate holder to report changes that could impact their access to the parent's resources or the parent's expertise. I like the first example a little bit better because in addition to that, it also states that the certificate holder must provide information for the department to evaluate whether those changes in the parent could result in a significant adverse impact that council hasn't previously addressed. And I should have said that if at any time during the presentation you have any questions or you want to slow down and discuss something, just let me know. Next slide, please, Nancy. Another example, these are more examples of conditions that council has included in recent site certificates. Again, seeking to ensure that the applicant certificate holder will always have their access to qualified technical experts. Here, I like example one a little bit better because it requires the certificate holder to demonstrate that they will utilize qualified personnel for each major stage for construction, operation, and retirement. The second example focused really just on construction. Next slide, please. And yet another condition. This condition, as you can see, requires that any violation, even though council allows an applicant to rely on a parent to meet the organizational expertise standard, the applicant or certificate holder remains responsible for any violation for compliance with the site certificate. Next slide, please, Nancy. Council enforcement authority. So why would we consider council enforcement authority in the context of the organizational expertise standard? It's to highlight that if council is concerned that a parent company isn't sufficiently supporting a certificate holder to comply with site certificate conditions, council can inspect the facility. We can send our inspectors out to ensure that the conditions are being met. Council can impose civil penalties if conditions are not being met. And ultimately, council could suspend or revoke the site certificate for failure to comply with conditions or requirements. Just as a side note, the certificate holder would have the right to request a contested case if it disputes the basis for a suspension or revocation. Now I'm going to turn to the retirement and financial assurance standard.
Chair Grail, you're on mute.
Thank you. I just realized that. Thank you. Excuse me, Patrick, I have a question, and I don't know if either you or Todd are able to answer, but has that ever happened where a certificate has been revoked for non-compliance?
Not in the time, I've been with the DOJ for 5 years, not in my time. Todd might be able to have more institutional knowledge.
Yeah, Chair Grill, to my knowledge, no, certainly not in my time here. I'm not aware of any even prior to that, going back to the beginning of the council, but I don't have an exhaustive sort of, I've not done that full research, but I can just say not to my knowledge.
And please do not go digging for it. I presume by now it would have come up in any of our numerous conversations. It was just a question. Thank you.
Turning to the retirement and financial assurance standard, these two, as you'll see, kind of go hand.
Sorry, Patrick, I was on mute. Chair Grail, Cindy Condon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Before you start on retirement and financial assurance, and they are obviously separate standards, and I think sometimes we have a tendency to conflate the two. So I do want to make sure I ask them in the appropriate for the appropriate standard. Ask my questions for the appropriate standard. So with respect to the organizational expertise, and I don't think I missed this, but in my review of the applicants as we have seen them, what is required if we're assessing the parent, what we're receiving is thin, I guess. Can you go over exactly what is required when an applicant is relying on the parent company for this standard? What is required of the parent company?
We could go back and review the rule. Nancy, if you could go back probably to the second slide that actually shows the rule.
This one?
No, the rule. Yeah.
So this is the standard.
Right. Right. And I guess when I look at this organizational expertise standard and the supporting information, we see the articles have incorporated. I'm asking specifically about when talking to the parent company or the site applicant and saying we need this. We're asking for the articles of incorporation, and to my understanding, we're not asking for financial information about the parent company. We are digging a bit into, have there been issues with respect to the parent company or projects related to the parent company? That can somebody just articulate that in detail, how we cut, this is the rule, but what exactly are we reviewing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I follow. You're saying what evidence or what documentation are they providing to demonstrate their ability to comply with the standard? So that would go to what's required in Division 21, which I don't have up here. We could look at that, or Sarah might be able to tell you right offhand what applicants typically provide to the siting analyst. Is Sarah on?
Sarah there, I mean,
She might not.
She is not on right now.
Okay. If I can continue this, I guess one of my what I'm curious about is with most of our other standards, we are relying on, the council is relying and the department is relying on work by other agencies, which is detailed work and pretty in-depth work of asking for their review, but also the applicant's materials as well. And with this standard, just with the projects that I've seen since in my tenure, we are more limited in this review. And I that's why the evidence that they're presenting is really important. This is one we are responsible for the review of, and we're not counting on other agencies to review. And so I would like to delve into that.
I think what, and again, I believe what you would typically see as far as documentation, and that's why it's important to recognize that the standard says applicants' access to expertise is built into the rule. I think they'll often cite and give information about other projects that they have developed that are of a comparable nature. And it might not be the applicant, the LLC itself, that has developed those projects, but it's their parent company that has extensive experience in developing wind farms or solar PV facilities. And so because we have that provision that says the council may consider the applicant's access to that expertise, that it's appropriate for them to rely on their parents in that context. As far as the specific type of documentation, other than, as I've said, it's descriptions, I think, and references to other projects that they've built, but I don't know offhand how they exactly document that.
Okay, and I think one of my concerns is that access doesn't mean necessarily available. They may have access to it, but we don't know what the availability is. The parent company always has the right to say yes or no, I presume. And so I guess to put this another way, I am curious. I view our issuance of a site certificate as an asset that we are saying we're granting this to you because we've examined your organizational expertise and find it satisfactory. But if we're not examining the organizational expertise of the applicant, because many of the applicants are presenting as single project LLCs that don't have much, and they are relying on the parent, but we are not doing a robust review of that parent, then I'm not sure how our assessment is complete. And so I just
so you're questioning whether or not, as part of our review, we're confirming that the parent has the expertise?
That the parent has the resources and expertise and has some sort of agreement or obligation to the single project LLC that we're dealing with that hasn't done, or I think many of them haven't done projects elsewhere because they're single project specific LLCs, if I understand it correctly. Without that, I'm just not sure how we make a complete assessment to say, yes, this we have confirmed that not only is there access, but the parent company is obligated.
Is obligated, I'm sorry, to do what?
Obligated to provide the resources to develop the project as it is presented to us.
So that goes back, if we go to the next slide, Nancy, the conditions that we include, go to the next one. We went through a few of the conditions that we include to make sure that the certificate holder, the actual at the LLC who's applied, continues to have access. I think what you're saying is, while we already have conditions, you can go ahead to the next one, please, Nancy. Well, we already have conditions that ensure that they will have ongoing access to that expertise, those resources. It sounds like what you're saying is you want to make sure in the first place that the parent has the resources or has the expertise.
And is obligated to provide it. These conditions that we have here all speak to a transfer of parent company. When we're assessing a site application for the first time, it's not a transfer.
Okay, so, and this, I'm glad you're asking this now because it is in the context of this standard. At the end of this presentation, I have a couple of conditions that you might consider including, or additional conditions. And so, but it sounds like what you would propose doing is have a condition that requires the applicant to demonstrate that the parent, when an applicant is a single purpose LLC, that's relying on a parent to demonstrate compliance with this standard, that you would ask them to provide some documentation that shows the parent has made a commitment to the applicant to provide the resources for the project.
Yeah, and I not only that, but provides the foundation for them to be able to perform according to the commitment. You know what I mean? That they have the resources, that the parent company hasn't been sanctioned by another state or has problems around the world or whatever, that we have done a robust, if an applicant is relying on the parent company, then our review, our robust review goes to the parent company and its obligation, a commitment to to support the site applicant for this project. So not just the commitment itself, but the review of the parent company, or the parent company that is providing the resources, expertise.
Okay, I follow you. And to my knowledge, I believe we are looking at parent companies as well, but that's something that I would want a siting analyst to confirm for us. So
Yeah, I would just confirm, we do look at the parent company. I mean, I think the question, is, are we looking at it, to your satisfaction? What's the evidence that they're providing? I mean, the short answer is yes, we do all the things that you're saying. It's just, is it enough? I think is really the question.
Yeah, that is my basic question, I guess. And I know it's not the first time you've heard it, but yeah, I'm concerned about it. And these applicants, our current applicants are very, very different than past applicants, who might have been, investor-owned utilities that have a rate base. They're very, very different than what we're seeing now. So it is that robust review, that a more robust review, I guess, that I'm curious about. I'm not sure I'm proposing it right now because this is just for discussion. And I did appreciate the slides that you have with some suggestions or thoughts about changes, but I did want to raise it here because it is particular to the organizational expertise.
yeah, and we'll talk about it. We can circle back and talk about it again at the end of the presentation. And then, of course, at any time, if you would like to, flesh it out a little bit more and suggest something that we could, the next time these rules are opened, then we could then propose to stakeholders input.
Madam Chair, this is Ann Byer.
Yes, Councilmember Byer.
So just a couple observations. I agree that linkage between the LLC and parent company probably has to be better established. I think in one of the recent applications, we had a letter from the parent attesting to their relationship to the LLC, and that may be something fairly pro forma that we add as a condition of the site certificate review and approval, just to clarify that the parent is indeed going to be there. I think the tension for all of us is we've never tested this. We haven't had site certificate holders be so unresponsive in applying their conditions that we've had to take action against them through either compliance or pulling the certificate. So kind of uncharted water. Back to organizational expertise, the language is a little odd. It says access to technical expertise. And we've had some developers come to us who have not operated in Oregon yet. They may have a parent company with many resources. Do we consider in evaluating access to technical expertise, their suite, their cadre of contractors and technical experts who might have that local expertise? Is that a fair consideration? I know it gets away from the corporate structure, but should we be considering who they bring on their team in evaluating technical expertise? Thanks.
There is one of the conditions that under which we do look and ask them to demonstrate that the people that they're using are qualified. So if it's the one condition I mentioned, where it's at each stage, they're required to provide to us information about who is constructing the facility for you, what's their qualifications, who is going to be operating, what are their qualifications, who's going to be retiring the facility, demonstrate to us that they're well qualified. So that condition is something that we haven't included in all site certificates, but have been including in recent ones, and I would suggest that we continue to do that. Anything else on organizational expertise?
Cindy again. Just I had a question and this is more general. There are other agencies, state agencies, that provide grants, and I mean, we're not providing a grant, but we are granting a site certificate. And I'm wondering if there's been any look into other agencies or the Department of Energy itself, which gives grants, that the review in grant making, what is the review in order to make that grant? I'm just wondering if there's some parallel here that might be used to inform our work.
There might be. Grants are usually pretty specific to whatever legislation authorized the grant, and so they'll say they'll include qualifications for the grants in the authorizing legislation, and so it could be different for, obviously, depending on which type of grant it is.
Well, and what a little bit prompts the question is, we've certainly heard and read in the news some difficulty with grant making. There was a grant made, I think, by DEQ, maybe to a EV charger company that it turned out did not have the organizational expertise. I kind of tied it to our analysis of organizational expertise, and they received a grant, but may not have been worthy of it. Well, what review did DEQ use? And I think it was DEQ. I don't think it was the Department of Energy. Use to inform their decision that yes, this applicant for the grant is worthy of it.
I can't speak to that. I'm not familiar with those circumstances.
Okay.
But we are looking, as I just mentioned, to make sure that the people that our certificate holders are using have qualifications to do the work at each stage.
Right, and I certainly appreciate that. I guess because our review is at the beginning of, it's before development work really, or construction begins, that we're saying yes, we'll provide the certificate. So it's the information, it's the timing of information.
Nancy, can you go to, I think it would be the next slide. So here, Cindy, this might address what you're concerned about. And under example 1, it says before beginning construction, give us the qualifications. Before beginning operation. So we're doing it at the front end, but while they're in the process of constructing, operating, or before retiring, that's when they have to tell us and give us the qualifications. So for example, they've already constructed, now they're about to go to operation. Give us the documentation showing that they're qualified, they have experience in managing and permitting and operating the facility. Same thing with retirement. So even though the site certificate is issued before they construct, this condition requires them to provide that information before each stage.
And I appreciate that. This example, for instance, if we take A, they're required to provide it, and it says what the qualifications shall demonstrate. But if the department feels that the material presented does not demonstrate, is there a conversation? I guess I don't quite understand what the department's or the council's duty is with respect to, well, yes, they provided it, but it's not satisfactory.
I think in that instance, because the condition says that the qualifications shall demonstrate that you have the experience and you're qualified. If the department believed that the documentation that you had provided did not make that demonstration, we would state that you have not met this condition. And then you can go to the enforcement mechanisms that I mentioned previously, which is,
right.
You can say we're suspending until you provide documentation for satisfaction. If you don't think this condition is strong enough, then you want to be more explicit that you have to provide that. I think it's implied that the department would have that right. But if you think you want to make it stronger and say that you should provide those qualifications, that demonstration to the department's satisfaction, we could supplement to state that.
Okay, thanks. And again, this is really for discussion more, to provide a base. I'm not sure what I believe right now. I've certainly thought about it a lot, but I view the timing as somewhat problematic given the site certificate already exists at this point. But I certainly understand it's an attempt to.
Well, that's fair, but they might not know who they're going to use to retire a facility, right? So that's why it's built in that says before you retire, before you construct, give us that, make that demonstration.
Yeah, and I fully understand that there's a timing to their work too. But okay, thank you.
Okay, Nancy, can you bring us back to the first, I think slide 9? There you go. Thank you. All right, so we'll talk now about retirement and financial assurance. The purpose of this standard is twofold. One, make sure that the site will be adequately restored after the facility is no longer being operated. And 2, make sure that funds are available to restore the site if the certificate holder walks away from a facility. In other words, protect the state against having to pay to restore the site. I've highlighted in subsection 2 that council must find the applicant has a reasonable likelihood of obtaining a bond or letter of credit. But before we discuss that, I'd like to talk about subsection 1. To support council making that first finding that the site can be restored to a useful non-hazardous condition, the applicant must include certain information about site restoration in the application. Next slide, please, Nancy. So this is from our Division 21 rules, which of course sets forth everything that must be included in an application. In Exhibit W, the application must include information about site restoration. This is all the information that they include. I've highlighted in C the fact that they must provide a cost estimate of what it's going to cost to restore the site. The cost estimates are important because they form the basis for the dollar amount of the bond or the letter of credit. Reminder that bonds and letters of credits under our process, your process, are adjusted annually to account for inflation. The department also typically recommends that the bond or letter of credit include a cushion above the estimated costs of restoration. So there might be a cushion, typically 10% extra for project management, 5 to 10% extra for future, it's called future development contingency. That allows for uncertainty in the decommissioning cost estimate. So for example, in the future, there might be different environmental standards or legal requirements that are more expensive to comply with. It might just cost more to dispose of the equipment that's being dismantled. The cost of labor and equipment might increase at a rate that exceeds the standard inflation adjustment. So that's why we include that future development contingency, that cushion. Next slide, please. So this is a mandatory condition. It's obviously included in all site certificates. So it's important to bear in mind that the certificate holder must provide the bond or letter of credit before beginning construction of the facility. So in other words, the bond or letter of credit is provided after council issues the site certificate, but before construction begins. But remember, as I mentioned, for council to issue the site certificate, the standard requires council to find that the applicant has a reasonable likelihood of obtaining the bond or letter of credit. Again, because applicants are often single purpose LLCs, they might not have the relationship with a financial institution that their parent company does. Therefore, when submitting the application, applicants often present comfort letters in which the financial institution references its willingness to back the parent company. We'll look at a couple examples. Next slide, please, Nancy. So hopefully you can read this. This is a comfort letter that we received in the recent past, and I like this one because it references not just the parent company, but the LLC, the by name, the applicant by name. And it also describes the type of project that is being applied for. It says it's a solar energy generation facility. Next slide, please, Nancy. Sometimes the comfort letters don't reference the applicant or the project by name. They reference just the parent company. They say, we've got the relationship with the parent. We're good with that. That's fine because, as we've discussed, the certificate holder still has to provide the bond or letter of credit before they begin construction. So we're still protected. But going forward, I'd recommend that the comfort letters be more explicit and reference the applicant by name and include just a brief description of the project. That way we have a clear statement from the financial institution that the comfort letter applies not just to the parent, but it also applies to the applicant and the project at issue. Next slide, please, Nancy.
Chair Grail, this is Kent.
Yes, Kent.
Patrick, this is just my ignorance here. It says in that example, the issuance of a single bond, they must be qualified for issuance of a single bond in the amount of 10 million with an aggregate capacity of 200 million. What does that mean? The aggregate capacity of 200 million?
I suspect, just off the top of my head, that they're saying they would provide just what it says. They can one single bond for 10 million, probably for one project, but they have their total credit with that financial institution, the most they could do for all their projects would be 200 million. That's what I suspect that means.
Okay, okay, good, thanks. That's what I needed.
Patrick?
Yeah.
This is Cindy. One of the, or Cindy Condon, I guess, for the record. One of the things I thought about in this review, it's my understanding that we get comfort letters at the front end before we issue a site certificate. But we do not currently ask for updates of that. I mean, these projects can take certainly some time to develop, years. And I don't think we ask for evidence that this comfort can still exist. We don't update these letters at all until the security is required. And it's actual the security as opposed to a comfort level letter. Is that correct?
Todd might be able to answer that better for us. That could be that we just get the one comfort letter and then that we don't ask for it to be renewed. It sounds like if that is how we handle it, you would like them to update the comfort letters.
I think it would be prudent to do so. You know, we've seen some thinking there, some things in the financial industry recently, and there is some uncertainty about these projects and if they will be developed at all, and what happens to developers. And it seems like a comfort letter issued 5 years earlier there may not be a comfort letter issued 5 years later.
So you're suggesting, though, the scenario you're describing would be one in which the site certificate hasn't been issued yet. So they provided the comfort letter early in the application process. Site certificate hasn't been approved.
That is the one instance, but then if we're 5 years out from issuance of the site certificate, or 3 years out even, just like with the letter of credit, would the same institution be willing to provide the security instrument that gave us comfort when we first received it? You know what I mean?
So I think I'm following you. So then what you're saying, so in this instance, what you're describing, the site certificate has been issued?
Yes.
In that instance, why would it not be sufficient to rely on the condition that requires them before they begin construction to actually provide the bond or letter of credit?
Well, I guess it would give us a heads up that if there were no comfort, we asked for a renewal of a comfort letter, a confirmation of the previous comfort letter or whatever, and they refused to do it. I don't know, it might give us a heads up as to the financial situation, but yeah, that's the only reason.
So I can respond on a couple of different scenarios. The first is if during the application process, if an applicant submits their decommission costs, but we do not agree with that and determine that the costs are actually greater than that, and the comfort letter is less than what we determine. More recently, we've gone back to the applicants and said, you need to submit a different comfort letter, which shows that you have at least this amount. Like I said, that we haven't done that historically, but within the last couple of years, I think we've been consistently doing that. So that's one scenario. And second is between the application and the going into construction. No, we have not required an updated comfort letter within that time frame. So that could be 4 or 5 years old. That would certainly be an easy condition to put in if you wanted to have some frequency of providing an update, but we've not done that. As Patrick had indicated, we rely on the fact that they still have the requirement to submit the bond or letter of credit in the amount necessary. So that ends up being a filter that if they can't provide it, the certificate will terminate because they won't have the ability to go into construction. So that's just a sort of a go, no go kind of requirement. But, you know, we could obviously look at, you know, any kind of frequency of updates. And then I'd say the third scenario, if they do come in for an amendment to extend out the construction timelines, you know, we do evaluate whether they still have the sufficiency at that point. So we would require a new comfort letter at the amendment for a time extension request for beginning construction.
So just, so if a request for Cindy Condon, actually for the record, so if a request were made for an amendment and extension, it's at that time, so we're let's say 3 years out. And that's, I think, the maximum maybe that I've seen, that for completion of, or beginning of construction, that there would be a comfort letter at that point, which is certainly more timely. We're not waiting 8 years or, you know,
Correct.
for multiple extensions. Okay.
Yeah, because at that point, they still have to, I mean, you know, theoretically, they have to show that they meet all of the standards. Again, mostly they can rely upon what was in the record. But sometimes we have to evaluate, you know, what are their changes in circumstances on the ground or laws, or in this case, you know, whether they still have the sort of sufficiency of that comfort letter. So that's where we would require it, you know, again, so it wouldn't be, you know, if they get, you know, an original approval with a 3-year timeline and then getting a timeline extension for another 3 and another timeline extension for another 3, you know, we wouldn't wait until, you know, that sort of very end to figure out if they actually had that ability. There would be a couple opportunities to require another proof of availability to get a bond or letter of credit.
Okay, thank you.
Grail,
Yes, Councilmember Byer.
Councilmember Byer, this is just kind of a wonky question. We approved the site certificate this year. Construction begins 5 or 6 years from now with extensions. Do we do inflationary adjustments to the bond amount during that period between certificate issuance and start of construction? Just a curiosity.
Yes, so for the record, Todd Cornett, yes, the short answer is that when they submit the decommissioning amount and when, you know, council approves it, we determine in the findings, you know, what quarter of what year of, you know, that amount was. So if they submitted the, you know, request and, you know, a year later, council approves it, and we haven't updated for inflation, you know, in our evaluation, we would peg it to the date that they submitted it to us. And effectively then when they come in and say, hey, we're ready to submit the bond or letter of credit, that would have to be updated for inflation, you know, throughout that time frame, whatever that was. So
Right.
the answer is yes, we do that.
Yep. And I'm really comfortable with the start of construction as the date the bond has to be submitted. Does construction include groundbreaking or just structural components? Just out of curiosity, we struggled with this at the local level.
So there is a,
Oh, sorry, Todd.
no, go ahead, Patrick.
The definition of construction is $250,000 of work on site that does not include site exploration, investigation type activities.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I'm on Nancy's slide 14. Yeah, that's where I'm at. This is another back to the retirement financial assurance and mandatory conditions. This is an important condition because if the certificate holder allows the site to deteriorate to a point where it could impact the ability to properly restore the site, council could step in and bring an enforcement action for, as we've discussed, for example, impose penalties, suspend or even terminate the site certificate. Next slide, please, Nancy. Another mandatory condition, this one is pretty straightforward. It requires the certificate holder to retire the facility consistent with an approved retirement plan if they permanently cease construction or operation of the facility. Next slide, please, Nancy. Another mandatory condition must be included in all site certificates. It provides the basis for council to draw on a bond or letter of credit if the certificate holder stops construction or operation but doesn't retire the facility on their own. I've highlighted language in green. That's the language that I just described that allows you to draw on the bond or letter of credit. The language I've highlighted in yellow, I would characterize this as possibly unlikely to happen, but still good language to include. I say it's unlikely, for example, the first highlighted language, if a certificate holder stops construction or operation without retiring the facility, it seems unlikely that they're going to submit a retirement plan after receiving notice from us. But the intent is to give them that opportunity, to give them that chance to do that. The second yellow highlighted language, I would also say is possibly unlikely. If the certificate holder has stopped operating the facility but hasn't retired it properly, it seems unlikely that they would voluntarily pay any costs of retirement that aren't covered by the bond or letter of credit. Hopefully we don't get to that situation. The bond or letter of credit should be enough, especially since we include those future contingencies that I described. But it's good, nevertheless, to have this language in because it gives the state a foundation in the conditions for pursuing any costs in litigation that we might incur above what the bond or letter of credit covers.
Patrick,
Mm-hmm.
This is Cindy Condon for the record. So if the project specific, if our applicant holder, site certificate holder, this happens, they cease to do business, we act on the bond. Now we have the responsibility to return it to a useful condition. And those expenses run over what our bond is, even with the included inflation and risk dollars. At this point, there is no, and maybe the LLC is gone. It has been, it's just no longer operating at all. There's no access to the parent company. Our reliance on the parent company prior to the site, to issuing the site certificate, there's no access to the parent company with respect to paying the overage costs here. Is that true?
I think that's, yeah, there would be risk there. That's why it's important that we do the estimates and adjust them for inflation and include the contingencies. In the scenario you described, I'm certain that we would still, I would suspect that we would still pursue a parent company to the extent that we can, but there's definitely exposure there because it is the applicant and the certificate holder that is obliged to comply with the conditions. We have a letter of credit in the bond that the whole intent is to avoid that type of situation.
Right. And just couple that with some conversations we've had at previous council meetings. Many of these LLCs are organized in Delaware. They're Delaware LLCs providing protection to the parent company and other companies. Sometimes they're stacked subsidiaries, and it strikes me that those articles would protect the parent company
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's the basic idea, one of the basic ideas of parents and subsidiaries is you're setting up the subsidiary to provide some distance between you and the parent. And then that's, you're then would be getting into a whole different arena, which is called piercing the corporate veil.
Right.
And you're trying to either get to the parent or to the individuals behind the company, and that is an arena that we don't even want to get to, which is why we have all of these other conditions that we've been discussing that are set up to avoid that situation. Again, which is why it's very important that we hold the applicants to demonstrate to us that we're comfortable with the costs that they're estimating for decommissioning. And I could provide one example where we have pushed back on applicants, where applicants said, well, you should give us credit for the scrap value of our facility. In other words, you should be able to, if you got to the point where we're gone, you should be able to sell the materials that are left on site for scrap value. And so you should reduce the amount of the financial assurance that we have to provide in order to account for scrap value. We made a pivot, I don't know how many years ago, that said we will not consider scrap value when imposing the financial assurance condition, the amount of the bond or the letter of credit. So that's just one example where we are taking as many precautions as we can to avoid the type of situation where the state has financial exposure and has to pay out of its own pocket for these types of situations.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. So this isn't in a mandatory, well, the beginning of the condition is the standard mandatory language that we discussed a few slides back. The language in green, you'll recall from our meeting last December, when we were talking about the West End Solar Project site certificate. And we discussed wanting to ensure that the state is protected if during operations, council learns of developments that merit increasing the amount of the bond or letter of credit. So something is happening at the facility, they're having compliance problems, or might not be something at the facility. We might have learned that it's going to cost more to dispose of wind turbines than we originally thought. If there are those types of developments, either at the facility or in the marketplace, this language in green that we added in that particular site certificate would assist in ensuring that the council can adjust the financial insurance amount. Going forward, I would recommend that council continue to include this type of provision in site certificates, but I would recommend one revision. Here we say council reserves the right to adjust the financial assurance if it determines it's necessary to ensure that the amount is adequate to maintain health and safety of the public and environment. I would instead state that we reserve that right to adjust the amount if council determines it's appropriate and necessary to restore the site to a useful non-hazardous condition. And there are two reasons for that. First, because that's what the standard requires. The standard itself requires restoration to a useful non-hazardous condition. But second, returning the site to a useful condition might not have anything to do with protecting health and safety. For example, clearing solar panels from a property so it can be farmed again, as we discussed earlier today, that might be necessary to return the property to a useful condition, but it has nothing to do with protecting public health and safety. So again, this stems from, and it's another example of how we're evolving, and we're trying to make sure that we're adequately protected. This is a provision that we just included in December that I would recommend you consider including with that revision that I just mentioned.
Patrick, this is Marcy. In addition to what you said about it being, that's what the standard says, I think anytime that we can be consistent in our use of language, it's going to help us, one, in our evaluations, and two, be crystal clear to the applicants of what the expectation is.
This is Cindy. I'm glad you mentioned it too, because this was in my notes, and my question was, does safety include that return to useful condition? So I would hardly endorse the change, the suggested change.
Now we all have to remember that.
Nancy?
Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. And actually, I think that's the end of the, the substantive portion of the presentation. My intention here isn't to suggest things that you ought to do. I really just wanted the end of this discussion to be kind of open forum. If you have suggestions, and I know Councilmember Khan and you've raised, I don't know if suggestions, but questions and things that we would want to further consider. And I have written those down for myself, and I'm sure Secretary Cornett has as well. Are there any, we could walk through these things that I have on screen, but before we do that, are there anything else that you'd like to raise?
So this is Marcy. This is just, I think, perhaps a procedural question. Councilmember Condon said several times that this was open for discussion, but if we really were going to dive into it, whether to make things more clear or to explore things, is that where we would engage in formal rulemaking?
Yeah, anything, and this is, and I don't even know where these standards are on our rulemaking calendar, if they're on at all. But to the extent that you would want to make rule revisions, of course, that it would be best to make any of these changes other than, kind of the tweaks to conditions that we've discussed in rule, and get stakeholder input, because they're the ones that are on the ground and they would really understand what are the real life implications of things that we would potentially like to see done. So short answer, yes, best to do in rulemaking and get input from our stakeholders.
And I do see your last sentence that said require input from developers and stakeholders, but I just want to, in my own mind, be procedurally clear. So thank you.
Yeah.
This is Cindy. I'm not sure if anybody can see me, but so just a comment. I really appreciated this slide, particularly just with respect to action. And with respect to the first paragraph here, and for me, one of the issues is as I stated previously, council may consider applicants' access to technical expertise. It's not just applicants' access; it's the commitment of the parent to provide it. So it's a little change in language that I think would be more appropriate, because it is a commitment of the certificate holder. And then the next paragraph deals with the parent company as a co-site certificate holder, which I like the sound of, but I don't want to presume what stakeholders would think of it. But as you said, there's a reason LLCs are formed, and these projects are disorganized the way they are. I think we get pushback to that. So to me, I don't know what the best way to get that. If we're relying on the parent, it's their commitment to provide it, as opposed to access, which I'm not really sure what that means.
Yeah, and that's something I think you would get pushback on making the parent co-site certificate holder. I think what might be more reasonable is what I've indicated here, is at least to the extent of the particular standards for which they're relying on the parent, have a commitment that the parent is responsible for compliance with those conditions. You may still get pushback on that, but I think it would be a more reasonable request to make.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Again,
agree.
Want discussion with the stakeholders to get their input on.
Yeah.
And I think I've got one more, Nancy. If you can go to the next slide, I think there might be an additional one. This is one, Councilmember Condon, that I think that you have discussed in the past, where you indicated that it appeared that corporate documents created a division that essentially said parents were not responsible for actions, not liable for actions of the sub, and you were looking for something that a parent company would provide, stating that regardless of what internal corporate documents might state, for purposes of the site certificate holder's responsibility, the parent would be quote unquote on the hook, provide the funding or resources necessary. That's another one that I would want to get input from, because it's essentially, I don't know, defeating the purpose is the right term, but undermining what the intent of establishing that corporate structure, that division between the parent and the sub, was, what the intent is in the first place. Again, something that we would want to get input from, and something that I think would have to demonstrate why is this a problem? Why do we need this? Why does what exposure do we have that our existing rules and conditions don't already address? So to the extent that we would want to push for something like that, we would want to really be able to identify where are there gaps. And I feel that we've done a pretty good job over the last few years of shoring these up, as far as the boilerplate letters of credit, for example. We've taken a hard look at that, and we've revised that language and strengthened it, I think, and as well as these conditions that we've discussed today. Doesn't mean that our process couldn't be further improved, tightened further, but I think in fairness to our stakeholders that we should do that with their input, so we fully understand what the real world implications might be.
Cindy Condon, again, just speaking to this, I loved seeing this in there. One of the issues to me is what we are responding to is really the representations of the applicant that says you can rely on this, but we don't you can issue this site certificate because we are relying on the parent company, and we're telling you that without much evidence. And to me, this would speak to the evidence of that, an operating agreement, just as we've discussed before. It's just more concrete evidence of that. So I strongly agree with pursuing something like this.
That's all I have. This is obviously an ongoing discussion, and when these rules are scheduled for looking at, that's when we would pursue this further. But we can still, at least with regard to conditions, always take a look at conditions and tightening them, as we've discussed today.
Chair Grail?
Yes.
This is Ann. Just reiterating what Patrick said, that really we have good suggestions on the conditions and how we can tighten those and be more explicit about what our expectations are. Again, we haven't tested these. We haven't had applicants who haven't performed. If anything, they have just walked away from the projects. We've never got to the point of construction. I think the bond also provides a good safeguard as it's defined and laid out, with the expectation that the site certificate holder may walk away, but that bond will still be in place to protect the state. So sort of short term, really looking at our conditions to make sure we include some of the language that's been suggested today and in past reviews. That's all I have. Thanks. And thank you, Patrick, for lining this out for us, because it's pretty, there's a lot of detail, and none of us have a background that I know of in corporate law. It's clearly.
Yeah, we'll continue to work on it, and thank you, Councilmember Byer and Councilmember Condon. You're pushing on it and making us, take a harder look at these, and that's good. It's good to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to make sure that our applicants are complying with the standards and that the state's adequate.
This is Cindy, and I have a general question, and not necessarily related to these. Although before I say that, I think we've done good work on the retirement and financial assurance. I think we've certainly tightened that up. And again, my concerns now are what we're reviewing before we issue the site certificate. So I appreciate the notes you've taken. I think you've taken today, and looking at that harder. But a general question I had with respect to the retirement, what do we know that the responsibility? So these are many of these projects are on private lands, or most of these are on private land. That the landowners are receiving lease payments from the developers. Do we have any idea what's in those agreements as to the agreements they have to return the site that's used on a particular owner's property that's leased to a usable condition?
We're not a party to those contracts.
I know we're not a party to them, but it strikes me as pretty interesting that is a two-party transaction that we're not involved in, yet we're responsible for the cleanup of those if the person that made that agreement is no longer there. So I just think that's a bit unusual.
I would look at it from the other perspective. And if I'm the landowner or the developer, I don't necessarily want that document to be public. Why do we need to know the terms of that agreement, the financial terms in particular? What we need to know is that they have a good plan in place, that we're comfortable with the plan, and that they've provided us the adequate financial assurance to retire the facility if we have to step in.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting we do anything different. My inquiry was, do we know? And I guess partly because the landowners are now really relying on us, right? Should something go bump in the night, their reliance is on us to ensure the cleanup happens on their property, which they leased.
Correct. And they potentially have their own private contractual fees based on their contract that they could use separately from what we're doing.
Yeah, I understand. It was just an inquiry about if, you guys are close to it every day. So just wondered if you knew if there was anything in those contracts related to this.
I have not seen one of those. I've only seen some description of those contracts in the article about the Bigelow Canyon situation. I learned there was some discussion of the financial arrangement, but I haven't seen those. And I don't think that we have never, to my knowledge, we don't ask for that. And as I discussed, I don't think we need to.
Yeah, I'll just validate that that's not part of our requirements, and those are not voluntarily given to us. So, other than outside of what Patrick just referenced on Bigelow Canyon, I'm not aware of us ever seeing that kind of information.
Okay, and just one more question for me, Todd. Is there any conversation, or has there been any conversation with landowners in the past? Who are they relying on our organizational expertise review at all? You know, some of them may not have some people just may not go through a review process of the company that's leasing property from them, and are instead relying on us. Have you heard anything about that?
Not specifically, no. I mean, I would say that, you know, probably in the abstract, yes, that there's a regulatory process. We oversee that regulatory process, and that's included in there. So, you know, kind of, I would say just, you know, implicitly, yes, but we certainly have had no conversations with landowners, you know, who, you know, come to us and say, hey, you know, are you guys making sure that, you know, the people that are proposing to construct on our property have all of this organizational expertise to, you know, build, own, and operate, and ultimately retire it consistent. Never had that conversation.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question for you, Todd. I'm guessing that the vast majority, if not all, that I've seen of the projects in the last certainly 5 years, maybe 10 years, are LLCs. Do you have any idea what that breakdown is? How many are LLCs and where they are organized, where they are incorporated?
I would say I mean, you know, we have the investor-owned utilities have, you know, submitted some projects or taken over some projects. You know, Portland General Electric took over one of the Wheat Ridge kind of split projects. So the vast majority have been the independent power producers, you know, with single purpose LLCs. I don't know what the exact breakdown is, but I would say that certainly majority of those are that way. And I have not, I have to go back and look, but I have not, to my recollection, seen one of those LLCs that was not filed in Delaware. So I would say it's a good guess to say that they all have been filed in Delaware, but I, again, would have to go back and verify that.
Okay, and I do think it's important that we remember there's a reason for that. There's a reason for filing in Delaware as opposed to Oregon and whatnot. So anyway, thanks for the presentation.
So, Madam Chair, before we leave this agenda item, I just want to make sure that we have, as staff, clear direction on moving forward, to make sure that everybody's, you know, the council is clear, that we're clear on what, if anything, you'd like us to do. I think there was some good conversation about some recent changes that we've made to findings and conditions, and it sounded like that there was interest in kind of continuing those, maybe some changes to those, and we can certainly do that and make sure that we take note of that for future findings. We also talked about rulemaking. So where we're at with the rulemaking is, at least where this would fit in, where our current rulemaking structure and schedule is that we have the rulemaking alignment. You know, we have the phase 1 currently going on. That's a fairly non-substantive, and sort of moving some, you know, requirements, rules around. Phase 2 will be similar. It will be non-substantive or largely non-substantive with just sort of a repackaging. But when we get into phase 3, and phase 3 is really a set of rulemakings. It's not going to be one rulemaking. It will be where we start to tackle individual or groups of standards. And so this is where we would look at this right now, unless, you know, council wanted to identify this as a specific rulemaking. So again, I wanted to kind of tee that up to say, you know, what's your interest, you know, in pursuing, you know, this conversation, whatever the outcome may be, through rulemaking, and what is your prioritization to that? So it would currently be in that phase 3. We have not identified any kind of prioritization of those standards or group of standards. So, you know, looking for some feedback to say, if you did want us to tackle this in rulemaking, you know, where would you want us to put this in that phase 3 rulemaking? Would it be at the top, in the middle, at the bottom? You know, what would your preference be?
Thank you, Council. I will ask if anyone has any thoughts to share before I offer any, if I do. Anyone have any comments, questions to Todd's inquiry?
This is Cindy. And as you might imagine, Cindy Condon, to me, this is a priority issue, the organizational expertise. We, as I said, you know, we have done quite a bit of work with the retirement and financial assurance piece, which has, you know, it will evolve continue to evolve. But the organizational expertise issue, the evidence of organizational expertise to me is an important issue for issuing the site certificate. And to me, that's the first standard, and other than the general standard of review, but and that sufficient. I think we need to say what the evidence is, or certainly discuss what evidence should be provided as a parent, and look at the questions that actually Patrick had in his slides with respect to co-applicant and whatnot, and how we really review if somebody's relying on a parent company, how we incorporate that in our organizational expertise review. So to me, it's a high priority.
Thank you. Anyone else have comments?
Yeah, Chair Grail, this is Kent. I tend to agree with Cindy on this, that this is dealing with issuing site certificates, so I think it deserves a higher priority than maybe some of the other things. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Councilmember Byer or Choctaw, either of you have any thoughts?
This is Councillor Byer. I'm okay kind of moving slowly on this and improving our conditions. I think the way the standard is set, which is access to technical expertise, is pretty darn broad. I'm trying to figure out what documentation we need is something we'll have to think about. I think, as Patrick pointed out, there is a requirement to provide evidence of that technical expertise at each stage. So in the planning, in the construction, in the operation, in the decommissioning. So I think it is a critical piece of the site certificate, but thinking carefully about what that evidence is without being so burdensome in this pretty changing environment. So I'm kind of ambivalent.
Thank you.
If I may, this is Patrick again. That condition, I just want to point out that was a condition that we have included in some recent site certificates, but not all. And so I think what I'm hearing is that you would like to see that in all of our site certificates, where they have to provide that evidence of the qualifications and access at each stage, prior to construction, prior to operation, prior to retirement.
I think that's appropriate, knowing that that any developer would hire different contractors or different bits of expertise for those components. So thank you for clarifying that.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Thank you, Chair Grail, Cindy Condon. Just to speak to that, I understand that technical expertise, but to me, on the front end, and this could be argued, I suppose, it's the financial resources that are required to do the project, to even start the project. And obviously, they can get a bond, or they wouldn't start construction without the bond. But and I may be incorrect in thinking this, but this site certificate, should we issue it, has real value, and the state of Oregon and landowners and people proximate to the project maybe are relying on what is presented in that site application. And so for me, the financial resources and the financial assurance that they'll have the resources necessary to do the development is an important piece of that expertise, because they're telling us when we get a site application, we're going to start construction within 3 years. And we have this great plan, but if they're not given the financial resources to do it, they have a valuable site certificate that we've issued that doesn't benefit the state of Oregon as we saw it when we issued the site certificate.
Thank you for his comments. I just want to check in with Counselor Chalktooth to make sure he doesn't have anything. Okay. Well, then at this point, Patrick, were you going to say something after Cindy just made her last comment?
No.
Okay. So at this time, I think for myself, I understand the comments that have been made. I like the idea of the condition being consistently applied. I think this is a bigger lift than just quote verifying organizational expertise. And I want to make sure that we allow time amongst ourselves and then staff. So if we do engage or when we engage rulemaking, that we're doing it in the most thoughtful manner. I believe there's going to be significant interest from stakeholders on the topic. And so that's something that I would be mindful of. Todd, I guess my question is, do we have to make a decision right now? This was an information item. And I think that I would, be curious to, see where it fits in overall. I think it is important. I think there's definitely room to tighten it up, but I don't think this is going to be a de minimis effort.
So, Madam Chair, to respond to your question, it's not any time, it's not this year. So, we have the rulemaking schedule. We'll be lucky if we can get through the phase 2 rulemaking alignment, because we have the contested case one coming up. We have the amendment one. So we have a couple of big ones coming up. So, we're looking, into 2024 anyway. So it's sometime before we would even realistically get to this, even if, at that time, when we get into that phase 3 rulemakings, even if you decided this was the top priority of standards to look at, these 2 standards, it still would be likely in 2024. So we're a little ways out no matter what. Again, unless you wanted to reprioritize, your rulemaking schedule, which you certainly could do. But if we followed the rulemaking schedule, we would be getting into that phase 3 likely in 2024. Then we would come back to you with the request of what is your preference in terms of priorities of these standards. And certainly you could revisit this then, but it is good to know now if, at least at this conversation, you're thinking, yeah, we absolutely want to pursue this. And we think this is, the highest priority, if not one of the higher priorities. That gives us some ability to kind of plan. And I totally agree with exactly what you said. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in this. I think this will take some time. We'll have to have some good thoughts about this even before we initiate, rulemaking and a rulemaking advisory committee. But I agree that there will be a lot of interest in participation in this.
Thank you. So from my perspective, I mean, and maybe my brain's not quite working because I'm focused on something else to fly. What I would propose is that we say, I think all of us acknowledge the importance of it. I'm not a fan of altering the schedule just because there's always going to be a thing, and we haven't had, and I don't mean this, to minimize the issue, but it's not as if there has been a serious safety incident or even a financial thing that we've identified where something has, quote, been broken, so to speak. So I don't personally think we should alter from the schedule that we've already set. And this is one of the challenges of virtual meetings, right? If Tom, as the rules making coordinator, probably had something to say on the topic. So my opinion is keep the schedule as is and put this near the top of a priority list. Those are just my thoughts.
Chair Grail, this is Kent.
Yes, sir.
I agree with you completely. High priority, but stick to the schedule.
Thank you. Anyone else have an opinion to that idea?
This is Cindy. I agree with that as well.
Okay, thank you.
This is Anne. I agree. I think it's good to keep with the schedule and do some more homework on this pretty darn complex issue.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, Patrick, thank you very much. That was extremely informative and I would say thought-provoking, because now my mind is churning on a new topic that I hadn't been worried about very much. Now I'm not worried, but I definitely have ideas. So thank you for breaking that down in a way that was palatable to digest and understand. We always appreciate you providing the insight that you do to us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's helpful for me to go through it. And these are always available also if you want to refresh your recollection. Just a reminder, you can always revisit our council meetings on your website. And if you'd like this presentation in particular, I'd be happy to send it to you separately.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is the Cascade Renewable Transmission System Special Advisory Group appointments. This is an action item. We have Christopher Clark, Odo Senior Siting Analyst, prepared to present. Christopher, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as you said, for the record, my name is Christopher Clark. I'm a senior siting analyst with the Odo Siting Division, and I'm going to be presenting staff's recommendation for council to appoint local governing bodies as special advisory groups for the Cascade Renewable Transmission System. Next slide, please, Nancy. Great. So as a little background, on March 7th, Odo received a notice of intent to file an application for a site certificate for the Cascade Renewable Transmission System. The applicant is Cascade Renewable Transmission LLC, which is a joint venture of PowerBridge LLC and Sun2O Partners LLC. And I believe PowerBridge came and gave you a presentation on this project last year, I believe. PowerBridge is based out of Connecticut, and they've developed similar transmission projects connecting New York and New Jersey. One of those is called the Neptune project, and the other is called the Hudson project, I believe. I'm going to go over some of the specifications of the Cascade Renewable Transmission System in the next slide, but I did just want to point out that due to the size, location, and capacity of the proposed facility, it is an energy facility subject to abstract jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and forgive a typo here, this project or this facility is a proposed 320 kilovolt DC transmission line that would span about 100 miles between the Dalles and Portland. The majority of the line would be buried in the bed of the Columbia River using a hydrojet cable burial machine, or a jet plow, that's sometimes called. Additional segments would be buried in road right-of-ways adjacent to the river, or installed under some channels and some other areas using horizontal directional drilling. There'd be 2 converter stations constructed at near both points of interconnection for the line. In the Dalles, the line would interconnect with the Big Eddy substation at the BPA complex there. It'd be connected to the Big Eddy substation with about 500 feet of overhead 500 kV AC line. On the Portland end, there'd be a converter station built in the Rivergate Industrial District in North Portland. And that would be connected to PGE's existing Harborton substation, which is a little south of there and across the Willamette River by about 3 miles of 230 kV AC line that would be either buried underground in road rights of way and then installed under the Willamette River using horizontal directional drilling. Next slide, please. So yeah, this map just shows kind of a vicinity map of the project. This is the proposed alignment that was included in the notice of intent. There is a bigger site boundary, which I can show on my next slides, but I did just want to point out that in several places, the line as it's proposed would cross over into Washington. In particular, there's a about 7-mile stretch that would be trenched in the right of way of Washington State Route 14 and some other roads near Stevenson to avoid the Bonneville Dam complex. All the sections of the line that are in Washington will also be subject to review by the Washington APSAC. And then the entire project's also subject to federal review by the Army Corps of Engineers and other federal agencies. Next slide, please. So since we're talking about special advisory group appointments, I did just want to give some detail of where the line crosses through local jurisdictions. In general, in Oregon, the line is in Wasco, Hood River, and Multnomah counties, and then 6 other cities. This map shows where the line passes through the city limits of the Dalles. As you can see, the line connects at Big Eddy, which is that green square on the right-hand side of the image, kind of winds down the BPA complex and then follows Highway 197 up into the city of the Dalles. It then passes along the rights-of-way of Highway 30 and East 2nd Street, and then would enter the river via horizontal drilling near the Dalles Marina. So yeah, you can see there that it then exits into the portions of the river that are within Wasco County. And next slide, please. So this slide, I just kind of want to illustrate the limits of the city of Mosier are shown in red here. And this is one place where the proposed alignment as it is proposed now would not actually be located within the city limits of the city of Mosier, but the site boundary does include a portion of their jurisdiction that's within the river. And so that's why they're included on this list. I will say the city of Mosier has asked for some more information on whether or not they'll be affected, and we will expect to see that in the full application. Next slide, please. Okay, this shows the city of Hood River. Again, both the site boundary and the proposed alignment as it is now would cross over waters within the city limits of the city of Hood River, but none of the lands would be affected. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's again the city of Cascade Locks. A small piece of the site boundary overlaps with the city limits. You can also see that this is the segment that would cross over into Washington and be located on land, and that's to avoid the lock and dams shown towards the middle left of this slide. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So from the last slide, the line travels through unincorporated Multnomah County, and this shows where it enters into the kind of East Portland metro area. The line and the site boundary would include portions of the river that are within the city limits of the city of Fairview. I did want to show that the Gresham and Troutdale city limits are also adjacent, but are not included within the site boundary. So as a result, those 2 cities we're not recommending those be appointed as special advisory groups. Okay, and then this is the final map. If you could go to the last slide or next slide, please. Great, and this is the city of Portland. You can see that the line is proposed to cut through Hayden Island at about the midway point on some property that's owned by the Port of Portland and some other properties. It would be trenched across the island and then installed using HDD underneath the North Portland Harbor Channel, and then would be installed in the right-of-way of North Marine Drive to the converter station site, which is shown again in green. From there, it would be installed under I think it's the Ramsey wetlands, and would travel through North Portland in trenches and road rights of way to the Willamette River, where it would again go into HDD, go under the river, and that area of the river is a Superfund site, so they have used HDD to try to avoid disturbing sediments there, and then pop out on the other side and connect with the Harbertson substation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the land use approval process and just the review process in general, but I did want to pause to see if any of the council members had any questions just about the proposed route as it is presented in the NOI.
Does anyone have any questions for Christopher at this time? It doesn't sound like anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Chair Crow. Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. Great. So we are at the very beginning of the siting process. I know you are all familiar with this, but just to review, there's 7 major steps in the siting review process. The notice of intent is the first. At this stage, we've received the applicant's kind of desk level review of the project. In the NOI is posted to the project page. This stage involves giving public notice to the public, as well as getting notice to state agencies, local governments, and affected tribal governments. We sent out all of those notices on April 4th, and the deadline for comments that we posted is actually today. So if anybody is listening on the audience and still wants to provide comments, you can do that until the end of the day today. And there is information on how to get those comments to us on the project page for this project. And then the next step for us, and I guess I should note that all the comments that we received as of yesterday are available from the siting docket on the council's webpage. I will work on getting the additional comments that have come in today posted right after this meeting. Okay, and then so based on the comments that we get and the department's review of the NOI, we will be preparing a project order, which essentially provides a list of all the standards and legal requirements and study requirements that the applicant must address in their application. We are required to get that project order out towards the end of July. We are still waiting on some comments from some reviewing agencies and some local governments. So it is still in progress, and it will be, we expect to meet the deadline, but it may be towards the deadline. So once we get the project order out, the applicant will be working on their application. They probably already are. In the NOI, the applicant indicates that they intend to submit their application in the spring of 2024, but the NOI is valid for 2 years, so it could be submitted as late as March of 2025 without an extension. Okay, next slide, please, Nancy. Okay, again, review for the council members. The state siting process is a consolidated review. That means that we pull in a lot of the review that would normally be conducted by other state agencies as well as local governments. One of the things that get pulled into the council's review is determining whether or not the facility complies with applicable substantive criteria from local governments, comprehensive plans, and land use ordinances or development codes. The applicant may elect to either get their land use approval from a local government directly or from the council. In this case, the applicant has indicated that they intend to seek land use approval from AFSEC. To sort of facilitate that review process, the council is statutorily obligated to appoint the governing body of any local government within whose jurisdiction facility is proposed to be located as a special advisory group. So that is what we are asking you to do today. And then when the council does make its decision, just a reminder that that decision is binding on the affected local governments, and that any necessary permits or approvals addressed in the site certificates must be issued upon receipt of the proper form and fees by the local government. Nancy, next slide, please. Thank you. Great. So as I mentioned, on April 4th, we did send out letters informing governing bodies that they would be appointed as special advisory groups and requesting comments. Specifically, we asked the local governments to identify any issues of concern that they'd like to see addressed in the application, to give us recommendations on what the applicable substantive criteria might be, and to let us know what local permits would be necessary for the facility that would be governed by the site certificate. We also asked for recommendations for any necessary studies or that they wanted to see provided as part of the application, and the appropriate sizes for analysis areas for impact analyses. And then just as the slide shows, that request was just the first opportunity for the special advisory groups to participate in the process. We'll send out similar requests during the completeness review and then after the issuance of the draft proposed order. Okay, next slide, please. Great, so with that information and in accordance with ORS 469480, staff recommends that the council designate the governing bodies of each local government within whose jurisdiction the Cascade Renewable Transmission System is proposed to be located as special advisory groups. The list of the 9 local governments, local governments that are within the site boundary is provided on this slide. Because there is a separate order for each special advisory group, we recommend you appoint each through a separate vote. That, unless there's any questions, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. One question I have, Christopher, is if council, moves on, do we have to do each one individually? I see that's how they're listed, but I just want to confirm.
Chair Grail, that's our recommendation. I would defer to Patrick though on whether or not that's necessary.
I don't think it's necessary, but I'm, you can see it however you like. As long as let me try to be, as long as I think the motion language is set up individually, but as long as you to name motion, so we're clear as to who you're appointing, then one motion would be all right.
Chair Grail, this is Kent.
Yes, Kent.
I'll make a stab at this in one motion. I think I can do it so that it'll be fine.
Okay.
So, Madam Chair, I move that the council appoint the Wasco County Board of Commissioners and the Hood River County Board of Commissioners and the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners and the Dalles City Council and the Mosier City Council, the Hood River City Council, and the Cascade Lock City Council, and the Fairview City Council, and the Portland City Council as special advisory groups for council proceedings related to the proposed Cascade Renewable Transmission System.
Thank you. Any questions, comments on that motion?
Chair
Do we
Grail,
have a second for that motion? Yes,
Chair
Ann.
Grail, this is Ann. I would second Vice Chair Howe's motion.
Thank you, Counselor. Any further comments or deliberation?
Chair Grail, this is Ann Beyer again. I just wanted to let folks know that I attended the public meetings regarding this project hosted by the department. Staff did a great job. We received some really interesting questions, more than comments, on the project, and it will be really enlightening to see how this moves forward. So thank you to staff for the great opportunity.
Thank you for that comment and thank you for participating and getting some insight directly. If there are no further questions, Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Perry Chalktoot, I don't see Councilmember Chalktoot on the line anymore. So we still have 4. Ann Byer,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Kent Howe.
Yes.
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Christopher, thank you. Always wonderful to see you and hear from you. We appreciate it and we'll look forward to working with you throughout this process.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Thank you, council members.
All right, our next agenda item is the Madras Solar Facility Financial Institution List Request. This is an action item and we have Cicely Fleming, fiscal analyst, prepared to present. Good morning. Well, we're on afternoon. Good afternoon, Cicely.
Good afternoon, Chair Grail, members of the council. For the record, I am Cicely Fleming, the fiscal analyst in the siting division at the Oregon Department of Energy. I am here today to recommend council add the Arch Insurance Company to the council's list of financial institutions pre-approved to act as issuers of bonds and letters of credit. As you are aware, council rules require site certificate holders to obtain financial assurance to meet the retirement and financial assurance standard from financial institutions approved by council. Council evaluates its financial assurance forms and approved entities annually, and the last annual update occurred in January of this year. In April, Ecoplexus Incorporated, the site certificate holder for the Madras Solar Energy Facility, requested council consideration to add Arch Insurance Company to the council's pre-approved list for their use in obtaining a bond for the project. David Skidmore, Chief Audit Executive in ODOE's Director's Office, reviewed the qualifications of Arch Insurance Company and concluded that the company demonstrates sufficient financial strength to act as issuers for coverage provided to the state of Oregon. A copy of Mr. Skidmore's evaluation was provided in your meeting materials, and I believe Mr. Skidmore may be present on the line today, should you have additional questions for him. Based on the financial strength of Arch Insurance Company outlined in this evaluation, staff recommends that council add Arch Insurance Company to its list of financial institutions pre-approved to act as issuers for bonds and letters of credits for site certificate holders' use. And the slide here just shows all of the entities that have previously been approved by council, and then the addition of Arch Insurance Company in italics there. So that's how the list will look should you approve the recommendation today. And that concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you. That was direct and to the point. Does anyone have questions for Cicely?
Chair Grail, this is Kent.
Yes, Vice Chair Howe.
I'll make a motion. I move the council add Arch Insurance Company to the list of council-approved financial institutions for use by site certificate holders in obtaining financial instruments as presented and recommended by staff.
Thank you, Vice Chair Howe. Do we have a second?
Chair Grail, Cindy Condon. I'll
Yes.
second that motion.
Thank you, Councillor Condon. Are there any further, or is there any conversation, discussion about the motion?
Chair Grail, Cindy Condon again.
Yes.
Not specific to the motion itself, but I am curious, and Cicely, you might certainly be able to answer this, but with respect to the review of the list that we were just shown, and the recent banking financial industry upheaval, I guess, is there a reanalysis of these financial institutions, including Arch Insurance Company, on an annual basis? Or
Yes, yeah, that's what we did that in January of this year, and that's the typical timeline. We do that around December or January each year. So we
Of the
evaluate the
institute-
credit ratings of each of the entities on the list annually. Yes.
Yes, okay. And given the recent financial issues, I don't think any of these financial institutions came up as, in the mix of problems. But if something comes up, if we were to have read one of the banks in the news, is there opportunity to review just on an ongoing basis, on an ad hoc basis, I guess?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. If there's nothing further, Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Ann Byer,
Yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Marcy Grail.
Yes,
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
thank you. Well, everyone, we have concluded our agenda unless I've missed something. So I'm going to pause if Todd can tell me if I missed anything.
That is everything, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate everyone's participation and engagement. I know sometimes virtual meetings are challenging. I again apologize for my delay and fumbling getting logged in today, so I apologize for that. I will try to do better next time. The time is now 12:09 and the June 1st, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council is now adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
See you.